This is LBC from Global, leading Britain's conversation with James O'Brien.
Good morning. It's 4 minutes after 10. Thank crunchy it's Friday. I am going to dive straight into the schools this morning, but there's some other interesting stories around that. I think I will, for once, be like a professional, proper grown-up radio presenter and give you a little taster of what's coming up later on the programme. There's a former Conservative MP who's threatening legal action against academics who have identified one of her ancestors as a slave owner. I think that is one of the most interesting stories that we've stumbled across in years, and it's my job to make you share my level of interest in it. So stick around for that, particularly if you have a particular interest in the broader issues. I've got a feeling it's something that's going to be spoken about a lot more in the coming years. I certainly hope so, because it flipping well should be. And then I like the RSPB story as well, because it seems to me that the forces dedicated to opposing the truth are on the march once more after the glorious victory of Brexit for people opposed to the truth, and the elevation of Boris Johnson and then Liz Truss. We're back to, do you remember when they were all attacking the National Trust for telling the truth? All queuing up to say, I don't want the truth when I visit a National Trust house, I just want a scone or a scone. That's not quite a phone-in. And they're doing similar with the RSPB now. So the RSPB quite rightly called out about a few Tories as barefaced liars when it comes to promises not to reduce environmental levels, environmental protections. And then partly because, again, of the forces opposed to the truth having such sway and influence now in this country, that they've issued a sort of apology. I say sort of because they haven't taken down the original tweet, which wasn't in my way of thinking offensive at all. And do you know what? Guess what? Go on, have a guess. I am actually a member of the RSPB, a family membership no less of the RSPB, and I heartily recommend it to anybody and or everybody. 6 after 10 is the time. But we begin with schools. Don't all ring at once, all right? But I need a builder to tell me what's going on, as much as I need teachers and parents and indeed possibly pupils to tell me what's going on. So you as a builder could perhaps tell us that this is a little bit of an overreaction. 6,000 youngsters tomorrow facing a return to remote learning. In the great scheme of things, it's not a massive number. It's not a massive proportion of the country, but you can see why it's headline news. As the new term is poised to start, they've chosen this week to tell 104 schools, colleges and nurseries to close parts of their sites amid fears that they are at risk of collapse because of the concrete they were built with. And the overall number could be much, much higher. I mean, it could essentially apply to any building built between the 1950s and the mid-1990s. It's the Standing Committee on Structural Safety that has noted this type of concrete is very different from traditional concrete, and because of how it was made, it's much weaker. So we begin with that. 0345 6060 973 is the number you need, if you can just talk us through the building elements of it. But I want to do two slightly broader questions prompted by this scandalous development. And I think I'm suffering a little bit to the it's suffering a little bit from the, well, it didn't do me any harm syndrome. So you think I used to point out when we were discussing things like this that my fee-paying school had some classrooms that were put up in the 1950s, essentially porter cabins that were put up in the 1950s as temporary structures, but were still there in the late 1980s when we were studying, at which point I would say, well, it didn't do me any harm. And if I was in a boastful mood, I'd say, I still got an A in my O-level Latin. But I do think that the environment in which you're taught is important. And the reason how I know that is because the environment in which you live is important. And the environment in which you work is important. Where would you rather be working today? In a leaky porter cabin or in a state-of-the-art multi-million-pound studio? Sorry, that last one's just me. Would you in a leaky porter cabin or in a nice, comfortable office? You will be more productive, I think, in a nice environment. So I do think it matters. But what I don't know for sure is how the school operates. I was a little embarrassed by my own ignorance during the early days of the energy crisis when head teachers were explaining to me that they are in control of the full budget. So the pot from which a teacher's pay must come is the same pot from which the electricity bill must be paid. So I don't think many teachers signed up for that sort of responsibility when they went off to teacher training college, but that is where, if you are a head teacher, that is where you may have ended up. So the reason why you have to let a supply teacher go is because the cost of carrots has gone up. You're either going to have to do smaller portions at school dinners, or you're going to have to lose a special needs assistant in year 7. And the same applies to the energy, because when the energy bills go up and you've been told by government to pay your teachers more despite the fact that they're not giving you any more money, do you see what I mean? You've got a problem. You've got a serious problem of priorities. And this particular story doesn't seem to me to be a failure of maintenance, because if it is defective concrete, there's presumably not a great deal you could have done about it. But I want to open up the broader conversation about how run down is your school or your child's school. Well, that's it. I don't need to rephrase that in my customary verbose way. How run down is your child's school? How run down are our schools? Hit the numbers now. You will get through. 0345 6060 973. I don't know that I've got the second bit quite right yet. But as a teacher, yes, I have. As a teacher, so the first question about the concrete is confined to construction experts. All right, 0345 6060 973. The second question about how run down our schools are is open to everybody, but clearly teachers, head teachers, and parents or recent pupils are going to be rather better qualified to contribute to the conversation than the rest of us. 0345 6060 973. But the final question is one that teachers will have a particular perspective on, but which we might all have a view on. So how conducive to education is the environment of the school? How important is the environment of the school? I can see both sides of this argument with a rare clarity. Because, as I said a moment ago, some of the classrooms that we sat in were awful. And I now throw my arm in the air like Robert Lindsay in GBH and insist that it didn't do me any harm. But who knows how well we would have done if we'd been in nice classrooms. I remember when the language labs opened at my school, and you had little headphones. This would be about 1988, and it was like the deck of the USS Enterprise. You put on little headphones, and you had, I can't even remember why, but you'd be sitting in segregated little booths, and they called it a lab. It was the language lab. And I mean, I'm sort of thinking, wow. But looking back, I don't think my Spanish was any better than it would have been if we'd been sitting in a Victorian classroom with a teacher at the front lobbing board dusters at us. So I'm interested in that. I don't think there's a definitive answer to that question, but I don't like, the older I get, the more I find myself fighting back against that urge to say, well, it didn't do me any harm, or a bad dose of the my dayitis, when you think because that's how we did it when we were young, that's the only way and the best way and the necessary way to do it now. That's just silly. We know that's silly, but it's a good question. How important is the environment? If the roof is leaking, will you get a lower grade than you would if the roof was not? And how do we know? 0345 6060 973 is the number that you need. Chartered structural engineers also welcome to call in on the concrete question. I mean, when I say construction experts, it's a very broad church into which the entire congregation is invited. But looking at, I mean, you know, I've been writing a lot about sort of structural collapse within government and the collapse in what we might once have loosely described as standards in government. But there's an infrastructure issue here as well. You look at the state of some hospitals, some of those stories are chilling. A failure to invest over years now, over 13 years, is, well, these are chickens that will be coming home to roost for generations. Waiting lists, for example. One of the reasons waiting lists are so long, despite the fact that the NHS is still a recipient of a lot of money, is because it's all being spent today. None of it's being spent on 10 years from now. It's not being spent on infrastructure or equipment, which would reduce waiting lists in the long term. Instead, it's just being spent on patching things up and keeping the ship afloat for another day. A failure of investment brought on by a reduction in real terms in funding. And schools are probably the same, aren't they? Not as urgent, I wouldn't have thought, to have, I don't want to say luxurious, but commodious. That's a nice word. Have I used it correctly? to have commodious classrooms, not as important as having commodious wards, but I'd have thought it mattered. So there we are, 3 questions for you. The first, talk to me about concrete. 0345 606 0973. This is not, for the record, a radio show that believes it's possible to grow concrete. I believe such diversions exist. Question number 2, what is the state of the school? Like the physical infrastructural state of our schools, how bad is it? 0345 606 0973. And finally, how important is the commodiousness? I'm going to check this word in the break and find out that I've used it completely incorrectly. It probably refers to commodes. How important is the commodiousness of the classroom? A quick text. If the roof of your office that you're working in now was leaking, how would that affect your show? Asks Fabio. I don't know, Fabio. I think it would. Clearly, I'd be distracted. And obviously, I mean, to take you literally, there'd be quite a strong chance of a major electrical explosion. But when I was doing the show from my shed, I don't think the shows were as good as they are when I'm not. I mean, it was a unique set of circumstances anyway because of COVID and the fact that we only really had one topic of conversation for the weeks that I was confined to my shed. But I found myself going a little bit stir crazy, whether or not that was simply the isolation or the relatively, comparatively primitive environment in which I found myself. I don't know. I genuinely don't know. That's why I said there's no definitive answer to this. But if it was an office job, if it was a 9 to 5, it's like if it's cold. Think of Bob Cratchit not being allowed to put another piece of coal on the fire. Is he going to do more work or less work if he's sitting there freezing his proverbials off? 0345 6060 973. It's 10:16.
James O'Brien on LBC. James O'Brien on LBC.
19 minutes after 10 is the time. How surprised would you be? Okay, true or false game this. How surprised would you be if I told you that one of the first things the Tories did after getting into power in 2010 was to cancel scores of multi-million-pound school rebuilding projects? More than 700 school building projects cancelled when Labour's scheme Building Schools for the Future was essentially abolished by Michael Gove. I've kind of spoilt the game, haven't I? Too much detail stops it being a good true or false game. So how surprised let's start again. Ignore the last bit, all right? How surprised would you be if I told you that one of the first things the Tories did after getting into power in 2010 was to cancel plans to refurbish or rebuild pretty much every secondary school in the country? How surprised? Well, they did. Who'd have thunk it? And here we are today looking at the news that schools are being told to shut just a couple of days before the new term starts because, like London Bridge in the song, they are falling down. Lisa's in London. Lisa, what would you like to say?
Oh, hello.
Hello.
I was just phoning in about just working in schools in general, actually. So I've been teaching in schools for 13 years, and actually the state of schools at the moment, just in general, are pretty awful. The school that I'm working at the moment, there's a really bad mouse problem, and we actually cannot afford to get rid of them. Oh. So we are just sitting with them, running around.
Well, you see them. Now. You see them regularly.
We see them. Yep.
Every day?
Every day, and they are quite familiar with us all now, and they will sit on the windowsills.
Really?
Yeah. And we can't afford to get rid of them.
And they smell, do they? Do you have that horrible biscuity wee smell that comes with mice? Quite. Ooh.
Yeah, our cupboards smell like pet shops. They're pretty bad. And it's not the school's fault. We've just completely run out of money. And even with this 6% pay rise, obviously teachers wanted a pay rise, but many of us actually rejected it because of the terms that were given. It's coming out of our school's budget, which is now going to make it even more unpleasant place to work, even more stressful. We're going to have to buy even more of the resources ourselves anyway.
Story yesterday about teachers bringing food into school for their children.
Yeah. Definitely, and we used to be able to provide so much more out of the school budget, but now, I work in an area where there is a lot of poverty, and there are children that come to school without food, and so we do buy them breakfast, we do buy them snacks, because we know then, the only time they eat is at school.
And thank goodness you do that, but you obviously shouldn't have to. It's that terrible tension, isn't it, between charity and government, and things that government should do, then people step in and do from the goodness of their heart, and it almost lets government off the hook. But of course, if you didn't do it, children go hungrier. What
Yeah.
how does it work? So you can't afford, the head's in charge of the budget, I presume, and they just can't afford to bring in pest control, environmental control on the sort of level that you would need to deal with a mouse infestation.
Yeah.
And the thing about mice, of course, is that they breed like mice.
They do.
Or rabbits.
They do.
So the problem gets worse and worse.
A lot of money.
Yeah.
It does. It's and I think on a building of that size, you know, them to do 1 or 2 visits is not enough. They need to come quite a few times, and it's very expensive. And you know, the head has done everything that he can to make sure that we you know, get rid of the issue, but we just completely ran out of money. And of course, as soon as you stop baiting them and doing everything you need to do, they just continue to breed.
And the holidays won't have helped, I don't imagine. What impact does it have on the pupils, do you think, on the students?
I think the general feel is that it's just, if the schools aren't cared for, then they, you know, as much as we do everything as teachers to care for them, they just think, well, this is the environment that we're in. It's horrible.
That's isn't it?
To come to school and learn when you're smelling mouse wee and seeing them run up and down your bookshelves, and it's just awful. And you know, it's through no fault of the school, but the government seriously need to invest in schools, because teachers don't want to work in schools anymore either. I qualified with 6 other people at the same time, and I'm the only one that is still a teacher.
Really?
Because of conditions like this. Yes, lots of my friends have quit the profession because of pay, because of conditions. It's just horrendous. And things like cover teachers, our head then can't afford to pay for cover teachers, so then us as teachers become more stressed.
Of course, and then less likely to stay. Can I ask, I know I said that was the last question, but just out of interest, what sorts of jobs have your cohort gone on to do instead? Is it, or is that a silly question?
Many different things.
Yeah, it's a silly
actually,
question.
quite a few of them have gone into IT.
Okay.
And insurance and more office-based jobs. I think, you know, what they do find sad is they obviously don't get that feel you get when you teach, and you've done something well for
changing
everybody.
Lives.
Yeah, but they said actually their mental well-being has to come first. And
of course it does. And that's a great way. I think that little description there of care, how much do I care about my studies? Well, how much does the I don't know, the government, the Department of Education care about my school? I mean, it's not going to be a complete domino effect, but it creates an air of neglect. And if you are studying in an atmosphere of neglect, you are likely to be neglectful, I think. I really do. Thank you, Lisa. Paul's in Rayleigh. Paul, what would you like to say?
Morning, James.
Hello.
Yeah, I'm a parent governor at school, and I took the role on about 2 years ago and have oversight of finance. And I'll be honest, it's like pulling back the curtain, and you suddenly realise quite how perilous the state of school finances are. I think on average, it's for a primary school, it's about £5,000 per year per pupil for their education, and about 80% of that is on staff wages, and then out of the rest of that, everything has to be paid for, and there's absolutely no fat in it.
Yeah.
There's no ability to put money aside for future issues that might arise. And when you're paying. We did the budgeting process recently, and cost of getting rid of your refuse is is as much as you have to spend on books and resources for the school.
I don't think people appreciate this, do they? Because I do the news for a living, and I was taken aback by the simple explanation of the impact that energy bills will have on the ability to hire teachers or on the ability to pay teachers. It's an odd thing that you should be required to. It used to be more centralised, didn't it? It used to come down from an LEA, and things would be done to scale. But now each individual head teacher is like a sort of CEO almost.
Exactly right. And, it's a real balancing act. And obviously, staff within the school there's their wish list of things they want to do in order to, do the curriculum they want to do and the lessons they want to do. And it's a real balancing act between, what needs to be spent. I mean, when energy bills have doubled over the last couple of years, that's a support teacher out of the equation. And it's not like you can increase your income, that is fixed, and everything else is.
So really, we're talking. It's not even a managed decline, is it? It's an unmanaged decline, and it's like everything else. The parents and the pupils only get as far as the head teacher's office with their grievances and their complaints. They don't really reach as far as central government or the Department of Education. But there's no light at the end of this tunnel. Things just, to quote Yeats, WBH, things fall apart.
Yeah, exactly, and it's something that's going to continue, and it's this issue with the concrete this year, and then
is your school affected by this?
Thankfully we're not. But I mean, we've recently had some electrical issues in part of the building, and the only answer at the point was to sort of reduce classrooms without lights on and so forth, until the money could be found in order to resolve that issue. And that's sort of small compared to the possibility of a roof caving in. But you
haven't got mice.
No, thankfully. Well, I don't think we have.
I'm getting messages saying, tell him to get a cat at the school. It's a thought, isn't it?
But every school, I suspect, over the coming 5 years, 10 years, unless there's a change in the way that schools are funded, are going to be facing increasing issues with different things where things are failing.
It's contempt for the children, really, at its heart, or it's incompetence. I do occasionally, as I'm sure you know, Paul, go off on slightly unfounded flights of fancy, and I do wonder whether we're living in an era where the ruling party thinks that education is wasted on the masses. Why would we prioritise school? It feels like that, but I'm not ready yet to believe that is the reason.
It certainly does feel like that. As the previous caller mentioned, the government says, right, okay, teachers are going to get this pay award. There's no adjustment in the funding for schools, so that needs to come out of the already squeezed pot. And then, the energy costs and the cost of paper and, all of these things that affected the nation over the last couple of years. And yet there's no more funding coming in at the top, and so it does seem like a certain contempt, and it seems like a problem that there's no political value in solving it now, because you're not going to see the benefits for 10 or 15 years.
And yet there is apparently political value everywhere, from the Tory backbenchers to the comment pages of the Daily Telegraph, in having a hissy fit about the removal of VAT exemptions for private school fees. It's funny, isn't it, how that works? Probably more newsprint expended in anger and outrage about Labour's proposals to stop private schools having charitable status with regard to their VAT than there is in the fact that state schools, which make up over 90% of the school state, are falling apart around the pupils' ears. Thank you, Paul. We shall see. I mean, I may be misrepresenting the commentary out there, but certainly people like me populate the media and are more likely to be privately educated and or privately educating our children. So these issues get a ridiculously disproportionate amount of coverage. If you were a Tory MP talking about anything else, you'd say you can't afford to send your children to private school, we'll get a better job then. But no, if you're a Tory MP talking about the Labour proposal to remove VAT from school fees, to remove the VAT exemption from school fees, you say it's outrageous. It's outrageous that the 7% or so of parents in this country who can afford to send their children to private, it's outrageous that they don't get charitable exemptions on VAT. I mean, it is pathetic, really, when you think about how skewed media coverage is. But we are where we are. More of your calls after the very latest news headlines with Amelia Cox.
James O'Brien on LBC. James O'Brien on LBC.
I don't know, really. I've got this obsession with tesseracts. Do you know what a tesseract is? It's one of my favourite things at the moment, a tesseract. It was the second book by Alex Garland, who wrote The Beach, which everybody read. And then he wrote another book called The Tesseract, which hardly anybody read, that's showbiz. He writes a lot of video games now. Supreme talent, brilliantly talented bloke. But the Tesseract is, imagine a cube, right? I'm probably going to get this wrong. Geometry's never been my strong point. But imagine a cube and now unfold it and make it flat. That's a Tesseract. So you fold... And I often think of Tesseracts when we're trying to work stuff out on the programme. But I don't think there are full answers to some of the questions we ask. You're never going to come up... It's not maths, what we do. It's not science. You're never going to come up with full explanations. because emotions are involved in politics. I'm just thinking about the energy expended on getting cross about desperate people in dinghies compared to the energy expended on the fact that your children's schools are likely falling apart around their ears, or they're infested with mice, or they can't afford to fix the electrics. And it is a direct consequence of 13 years of Conservative rule that began with so-called austerity, the big lie at the bottom of many of our national problems now. The idea, as Alexei Sayle famously put it, that the global financial crisis in 2008 was caused by there being too many libraries in Wolverhampton. And the lies perpetrated by George Osborne and David Cameron that it was somehow Gordon Brown or the Labour Party's fault that economic collapse occurred was the ideological cover that they used to strip back public sector funding, to close things, to abandon the Building for Schools project that was already in place, to shut Sure Start centres, to close fire stations, to close ticket office. I mean, everywhere you look, there's evidence of that massive lie. And then fast forward 13 years and here we are, learning that schools are being shut a few days before the new term starts because of the danger of them literally collapsing. During lockdown, when all the schools were empty, imagine what a decent government could have done. Instead of shifting billions of pounds to their mates for substandard PPE, they could have not only kept construction workers in work, but they could have fixed up loads of temporarily empty schools for the duration. But hey-ho, that sounds far too sensible. 10:36 is the time. 3 questions bubbling alongside each other today. We haven't had any attempts to answer the first one yet, although I think James in Camden is going to open and probably shut that case in a moment. What's going on with this collapsing concrete? Question number 2 is the simple notion of what it's like in your children's school or your own school if you're a parent or a governor. I mean, how bad is it? Or a teacher, crucially, if you're a teacher. Question number 3 kind of gets asked as part of question number 2, but if you want to come at it separately, you can. Is there any way of measuring the relationship between educational environment and educational attainment? I thought that the first caller's point about care, you're in a school where mice are running around, and the idea that you should care about your studies when the place where you study clearly doesn't care about you. I find that quite hard to resist. 10:37 is the time. Phone lines are open. A couple of phone lines free. 03456060973. James is in Camden. James, what would you like to say?
Oh, hi there, James. Nice to speak to you. First time caller here.
Welcome aboard. Welcome aboard.
I thought I'd give you a shout over this autoclaved aerated concrete issue. I'm a chartered building surveyor. I've worked in London for about sort of 10 or 11 years or so, and previously all over the country. And I've come across this substance a couple of times. I'll probably sort of start off by saying I'm no sort of world expert on it, but I'm definitely aware of it and have been aware of it for the past, or at least 10 years or so.
Right.
As an industry, this problem was first discovered in the 90s, so we're talking about 30 years ago.
Gosh.
And autoclaved aerated concrete was invented long before that and really came to prominence in, I would say, probably the 1950s and 60s. That's when you really started seeing it coming into fashion or rage. And when it's first put up, it's not too much of a problem, especially if it doesn't get wet. But after 30 years or so, it is absolutely true. It can just spontaneously collapse without warning, and it's very difficult to predict when and how that will happen. So,
I mean, is it a silly question to ask how often it happens?
I mean, thankfully, incidents of people getting injured and hurt by it are fortunately rare.
Right.
But it obviously is a problem, and the longer this stuff stays up there, the more of a problem it's going to be.
And does it go for, because of course it's all happening under the surface, so it all looks fine, and then it collapses. There's no early warning or slow attrition or anything like that.
Yeah, I mean, there's certain tests that people can do. I mean, they're not brilliant. Obviously, you can look at the early sort of warning signs of collapse, sort of faint cracking and so on, but that's not...
And they're going to have that if they haven't been painted for a while, aren't they? It's not, I mean, you're not going to know whether it's the surface that's cracking or whether it's the infrastructure. What was your gut reaction professionally then when this story broke overnight, when you learnt of the 104 schools?
Well, Yeah, I mean, not a massive surprise, really. I mean, I've been aware of this problem, like I said, for a good solid 10 years or so. And previously, all that I can say is the way that asset managers and stakeholders have managed it is they've tended to sort of get people like me in to see buildings, whether they're hospital wings, schools. I remember going to see a community centre that had this sort of stuff in it once upon a time. And we just basically do a report saying, yes, it's AAC, it's a deleterious material, it's problematic, we can't really say that it's going to come crashing down tomorrow night, but it could do. It could also stay up, perfectly fine for the next 10 years. And we're not the people who sort of really get to make the decision on whether buildings like this. Generally speaking, it's the asset manager or the person that owns it. So
would you be comfortable working in a room that you had described thusly?
Well, the scary thing is we all go through these sorts of buildings all the time.
Yeah, that's what I'm beginning to realise.
They're in bus stations, railway stations.
So is there an argument that this is an overreaction, James, given that it's a constant threat but not an acute or urgent one?
It's a difficult one. It depends how you judge risk, really, because at the end of the day, we could go around closing down every single building in the country that had a tiny bit of AAC on it on a health and safety grounds, and we'd suddenly find that we'd have hospitals all over the place that no one was allowed to walk into. And if you think about the current crisis that is present, not just in hospitals, but schools, but everywhere, really, this could create a lot of problems for a lot of people elsewhere. So I don't envy the government or the people that are set up to make these difficult calls and decisions, but obviously health and safety is a very important thing for everyone.
And there are 156 educational settings containing this concrete that have been identified, and 52 of those have taken protective steps already this year. So the 104 that haven't, I suppose it almost becomes inevitable that something has to be done about the ones that haven't. Otherwise, they never would. If it is this sort of juggling, this financial juggling act that other callers have described. James, thank you so much. That's real chapter and verse on what's going on. As a layman, a good way to understand it is that the concrete is aero-like, so it's full of bubbles. And I don't know if you've ever tried to take a piece of dairy milk and squish it with your fingers, and then take a piece of aero and squish that with your fingers, and there you go, there it is. Perfect analogy for you. And the schools are built of aero. Toby's in Bristol. Toby, what made you pick up the phone?
I qualified in 1991, so I'm at the end of my teaching career now, and I have actually finally stopped. And I remember how bad...
That makes me feel old.
Yeah, I know. Well, tell me about it. And so I remember how awful it was. I was supply teaching in places in Leeds like Belle Isle, where they were rebuilding schools around the children with asbestos.
Wow.
And when I started a job at a school, how appalling the conditions were, leaking roofs, buckets everywhere.
Yeah.
And then I do also remember the improvements that came along after 97.
Remind us what happened in 97? Toby?
Oh, I don't know. Something
I'll check later.
And then at Equal, I was still teaching after the 2010 election, and when Gove and Cummings were removed, built the building for the future, and the building, you could see it slowly degrading. I mean, it's a bit like the tanker analogy, and things carried on reasonably.
Yes.
But then, and when I decided to...
Oh, phone line's gone funny. Don't stop moving. I don't know if you're moving around or something.
I'm not moving.
That's it. No, there we go. Carry on.
When I left teaching, I was at the top of the pay scale, so I was what's called UPS, so upper pay scale 3. So if you look at today's teacher salary, that's about £50,000, fair whack.
Yeah.
And I was replaced by an NQT, and the money then went to help with building. And so you're not only losing experienced teachers because they're expensive, you're then recruiting NQTs, newly qualified teachers, who are perfectly good, nothing against newly qualified teachers, but they're relatively cheap.
Of course.
And you're then scrabbling around, as one of your earlier callers said, looking for where to take that money from, robbing Peter to pay Paul situation. And it's just so disheartening, because you do see the improvements in the pride that the children take in their school when it looks nice, when it's not falling to pieces.
Of course you do. And that's an intangible, isn't it? I mean, there's stuff you can measure. You can measure mice, you can measure leaking roofs, you can measure collapsing ceilings, but you can't measure that intangible notion of pride and care. And you're turning up to do a shift, whether an adult or a child. And if you're doing it in circumstances that make you feel you're being treated with contempt by whoever it is, the invisible authority that is in charge of your environment, then you're surely less likely to give it your all. Even subconsciously, Toby. Subconsciously.
Absolutely.
Oh,
and now I'm too expensive to return. And I don't think it's just me. I mean, I could take it personally, but I won't.
No,
but,
of course. Given the choice, I've got a limited budget. Am I going to hire? Am I going to buy the best car in the garage, or am I just going to get the best I can afford?
Absolutely, that's where we are. And I think it is going to be that situation where money will go back in. I have a reasonable hope that under new governance that money will come back into the system. But again, like after 18 years, it takes a long time when everything is falling to pieces. It does feel like it's on all fronts. Things are literally crumbling around us because it's almost an ideological.
It is ideological. It is ideological. There's no. I mean, look, and you get your Tufton Street vampires on the case, and what's the point of spending money on that? What's the point of spending money on that? There's no comeback. There's no kickback. And bring in the private sector to do it, so someone can make a little bit of profit, and then you get the ludicrous Taxpayers Alliance complaining about it. It is a complete mess, and everything is linked. But I'm beginning to sound like the kid in Sixth Sense, so I'll stop now. And I'll even resist the urge to plug my book again, in which a lot of this is explained in forensic detail. Toby, thank you. It's 10:46.
James O'Brien on LBC. James O'Brien on LBC.
It is 10:49. You're listening to James O'Brien on LBC, where we find ourselves once again contemplating the consequences of an ideology that sees spending taxpayers' money on taxpayers as unbearable. Secretly funded lobby groups masquerading as think tanks, of course, driving the last 13 years of government to a place where, because very, very rich people want to keep more of their money than they currently keep, driving the government to a place where public spending is decimated, and then wondering why schools are falling apart around our ears. A lot of people getting in touch with tales of hospitals as well. Mary getting in touch to tell me that Harrow Crown Court closed completely a few days ago because of building materials issues. Means trials were delayed. Sentencing cases that have been listed for ages were postponed once again. You're likely not to get to court, by the way, if you're a victim of many crimes now, until 2025. But don't forget that Suella Braverman has ordered the police to investigate more. And that's the point about distraction, media and politics. It's that all the time these idiots running these newspapers are telling you to get cross about X, Y and Z, while A, B and C is happening right under your nose. I'm cross about refugees and police officers wearing multicoloured helmets. But I'm not cross about the fact that the courts have got backlogs so long now that they stretch from Land's End to John O'Groats. I'm not cross about the fact that my children's school is falling apart around their ears. And full of mice. I'm not cross about the fact that hospitals are in arguably an even worse state infrastructurally than schools are. I'm very, very cross about gender-neutral toilets, and that's all I've. And that fella, the 30p Leenock, he'd let the cat out of the bag, didn't he? And then got promoted to deputy chair of the Conservative Party. Got nothing to fight the next election on except culture wars and transgender issues. And meanwhile, no surprise what's happening to schools and hospitals, to the legal system, to courts, and pretty much everything else. 10:52 is the time. George is in Southampton. George, what would you like to say?
Hello. Good morning.
George.
I am a teacher and a teacher governor as well at my school.
Okay.
And we put in a bid 2 years ago to I believe it may well have been the Levelling Up Fund, and we were successful in having our school rebuilt.
Right.
Now, when you put in your bid, you then get tested, and you get put into waves. So
Yes.
Wave 1 was all the RAC schools.
Oh, yes.
Our concrete was tested, we weren't RAC, so we got put into Wave 2.
Okay.
So we should have a new school by 2025, which is obviously very exciting. But I have no idea if this news is going to affect that. So
What did you think when you heard this news? Did you think that the RAC schools were all being dealt with already?
To be honest, when we got the RAC test, we were all crossing our fingers that we would have RAC, because then we'd probably be in a new school by now.
Well, except you wouldn't, would you? Because only 52 out of 156 have been
yes.
addressed. You'd be shut next week, mate. So uncross your fingers.
True.
If I understand it. Does that sound right to you? You'd be shut next week rather than at the front of the queue? You could still be at the front of the queue to get fixed.
Yeah, I would have thought so. And it's an odd one as well. So
isn't it?
We're in this weird limbo of spending money and not spending money. So we had to have our whole roof fixed.
Right.
Which cost a lot of money because it was leaking all over the place and making the school unsafe.
Yes.
But the school's going to get knocked down in 2 years.
Oh, man alive, that sums it up.
Yeah.
That is it. That right there, that's a vignette for austerity, isn't it? We've had to spend a fortune on getting our roof fixed, but the whole school's in such a state, it's going to get knocked down and rebuilt from scratch in 2 years anyway. That would, if it was your house, you'd go nuts, wouldn't you? You'd drive you potty. Mm-hmm. Oh.
Yeah, it's a little bit bizarre.
It is a little bit bizarre.
But we're really kind of like, painting walls and things like that. We don't want to spend the money on it. But we're in this weird kind of thing where if our school doesn't look nice, we won't get picked by the parents in our local area, and then our funding will go down because we don't have as many children.
Is there light at the end of the tunnel? I mean, you're just going to say a new government, I imagine, because you can't imagine any form of repair or reparation kicking in the current climate with this lot who I mean, they don't just preside over this decline, they lie about it when it's happening as well.
Surely the light at the end of the tunnel must be court cases. How can they get away with everything during COVID? And they're just getting away with fleecing the British public. I don't understand how it's allowed.
Well, no, I mean, nor do I actually, some days, and then other days you remember how complicated it can be, and you need to have the will to do it, and you'd have the massed ranks of the UK media marching onto your lawn and aiming their tanks at your headmaster's office, a school that had the audacity to sue the government, or individuals that had the audacity to stand up to authority that's backed up by the Mail and by Murdoch and by all their little sort of pound shop followers in the broadcast media. It's 10:55. George?
Yep.
Why am I selling tickets for my gig in Southampton more slowly than everywhere else in the country?
Oh, it's a very good question.
Why have you not been spreading the word?
Do you know, I haven't bought a ticket myself, so maybe I'll get on that.
It's a mystery to me. It's a mystery to the mayor of Southampton. I don't know if Southampton has them. 2nd of November at the Central Hall in Southampton is the one with the most tickets left. Would you believe? 10:55 is the time. Ben's in Birmingham, sold out in Birmingham. Ben, what would you like to say?
Glad that Birmingham's representing you well, James. Good morning. Good morning. You asked the question about whether it would be possible to sort of conduct a study on the impact that building quality has on educational outcomes.
Yes.
And there has actually been a bit of a study. It's actually an American study. It's by a man called John Hattie.
Okay.
And he's conducted a meta-analysis of 594 studies on building quality and basically determined that it is likely to have a positive impact on student outcome. And as a teacher and head of department myself, that is not surprising in the slightest, thinking about my own lived experience, especially from the angle of special educational needs students, where the classroom environment is vital. You know, we've got students with such sensitive needs that any slight change in their environment can have a huge impact on the quality of their day and obviously the quality of their, learning that they're doing.
Yes.
And there's already not enough funding for special educational needs students. Special educational needs schools have been slashed. So this is just another element for us to contend with on a daily basis.
Can you anecdotalise it for me? Give me a sort of... go on.
Sorry to interrupt. So about 3-4 months ago in the spring sometime, we had torrential storms in Birmingham. We came into school one morning, it was Tuesday morning, and as soon as I walked through the door, the whole block, which is a new block as well, by the way, just stunk of damp. And I took one step onto the carpet, it squelched underneath. There's no additional classrooms. We can't re-timetable them for the day. So we've got, radiators trying to dry the floor out. You've got kids sat there literally with water coming up over the side of their shoes because it's everywhere. We'd actually got an IT block as well in the block that I teach in. Laptops destroyed, ruined. That's an additional cost that's going to have to come out of a budget that's already thinly stretched.
Yeah.
Our gas and electric has gone up 300%. It's just... you asked a second ago to your previous caller, what's the light at the end of the tunnel? And it doesn't really feel like there is one at the moment.
I didn't understand COVID. In '97 when Blair, because I was callow. I don't know how old you are, but I was too busy living it up. And education, and that's what they did, isn't it? They came in and they turned schools around, and then for 13 years they've been slowly unpicked, or they've unravelled again.
Yeah, well, I only qualified about 5 years ago, but I obviously went to school through the Labour government, or the vast majority of it. But for me, you had a caller quite a while ago about it was a doctor who said it's all he's ever known. And that's right. For my generation of teachers, that's the same with us, with teaching.
You're talking about the doctor dealing with unbearable circumstances that would be considered unbearable for an older doctor. Yes, it was his auntie, actually, who rang in, I think, saying that he doesn't know any different. It was his second Christmas on the wards, and he just doesn't know any different. That's the frog boiling, isn't it? You forget when you talk about boiling the frog, you're presuming that you're going from A to Z, but actually, as you remind us, if you qualified 5 years ago, you're already at P. You don't know. You don't know what A to P felt like for teachers. You just know what P feels like as you head at breakneck speed towards Z.
Yeah, I mean, you obviously go on the stories that older teachers and more experienced teachers tell you, but it just seems like a different world for some of us.
Yes, of course it does. Thank you, Ben. That's very helpful. And I noticed we've got a quick entry for Idiot's Corner as well. This is someone called Lee. He's even added his surname, which is, dare I say, conclusive proof of his belonging in Idiot's Corner. Oh, James, when are you going to realise both parties can't govern, being used to being puppets for the EU, caretakers, and obviously the $5 billion a year on illegal immigrants takes away from the infrastructure being kept up to scratch. Wait and see, Starmer will be useless, says Lee, who thinks that being in the European Union is somehow responsible for the type of concrete that's being used in schools and other buildings in this country since 1950. Well done, Lee. 10:50, right, then welcome to Idiot's Corner. I have a feeling you might get a season ticket. It's coming up to 11 o'clock. A really interesting one next.
James O'Brien on LBC. James O'Brien on LBC.
It's 3 minutes after 11 and you are listening to James O'Brien on LBC. I find this conversation fascinating, or rather this subject fascinating, and I want you to think about it, all right? I properly think about it before ringing in, because I sometimes find my mind changes in the course of contemplation of a single story. You start off perhaps seeing a headline or hearing me tell you what the broad subject matter is, and you think you know what you think, and then you look a little deeper into it and you find, well, it depends what you're built like, doesn't it? It depends whether you like thinking or not. And I know that can sound condescending, but it really isn't. I completely understand the attraction of not thinking. I mean, first of all, you get a job on GBBs, and they're quite lucrative, I'm told. The simplicity of existence, when you just pick an opinion and stick to it regardless of the facts, is not hard to understand. I can see how it can be quite seductive. I don't understand how they lead to the next one. I don't understand how being wrong about vaccines or thinking that COVID was a hoax leads to you believing that the World Economic Forum is up to no good, or that 15-minute cities involve anything other than traffic calming measures, or that environmental initiatives like the ULEZ scheme is somehow fraudulent, or I mean, whether it works or not, it's clearly designed to improve air quality. The idea that it's designed to do something else is bonkers, truly bonkers. But I guess once you've decided that your opinion will be based entirely upon tossing a coin as opposed to thinking about things, then you start collecting similarly bonkers opinions. So if you like thinking about things, I think this subject is really, really interesting. Antoinette Sambach, I don't know if you remember her. She was a decent Tory MP until that big purge in 2019. She wasn't there for long. She had a Cheshire seat for about 4 years, and she was one of the people that Boris Johnson effectively had to get rid of in order to prevent members of his own party safeguarding parliamentary sovereignty. I don't know if you remember that, when he purged 21 MPs because he didn't want the House of Commons to have any say over the progress of Brexit or the progress of negotiations. So he essentially, he unlawfully prorogued Parliament, and then he had to get rid of all of his own MPs who were not on board with his lies and nonsense. They've all been completely vindicated by history, of course, but it doesn't matter. They lost their jobs. She was deselected in her own constituency, as was Philip Hammond, the former Chancellor of the Exchequer, for the crime of telling the truth. As we're going to talk in the next hour in the context of the RSPB about the forces opposed to the truth. And obviously it begins in modern Britain with Brexit. But that period in 2019 when telling the truth was an arrestable offence in the Conservative Party is incredible. You think of Sir Nicholas Soames, Winston Churchill's grandson. I mention that because the kind of people who are opposed to the truth claim often that Winston Churchill is their hero. So his own flesh and blood descendant was essentially expelled, purged, expunged from the Conservative Party because he insisted on telling the truth. He insisted that the House of Commons, that Parliament retained the right of scrutiny over mooted Brexit-related legislation. And they lost. The people opposed to the truth prevailed. And she was one of them, and often very impressive on the subject as well. One of her ancestors was a slaver, a slave owner. He was the founder of a company called Sambach Tin and Co., a Liverpool-based company that monopolised much of the Demerara sugar trade in what is now Guyana. This would be during the 18th and 19th centuries. The epic amounts of wealth were then brought back to Britain, and from that period, that wealth, Antoinette Sambach is descended. Okay, so far so good, right? Utterly uncontroversial, nothing to get your teeth into here. Is it going to be another one of those, should they apologise or should they pay reparations? We've seen a descendant of William Gladstone very recently offer apologies to people in the countries where his forebear had plantations and slaves. We've seen a BBC journalist called Trevelyan, I forget her Christian name, her first name, or Laura, I think, Laura Trevelyan, do similar and discover in your family tree actual slavers and do a form of, if you like, a retrospective repentance, you might call it. The Earl of Harewood at Harewood House up near Leeds has a wonderful exhibit on this subject, and it features a very striking portrait of the actor David Harewood, who discovered when researching his own family history that the reason why his name is Harewood is because his ancestors were owned by the ancestors of the Earl of Harewood. Owned. And this is not what today's story is about. Today's story is about Antoinette Sambach threatening the University of Cambridge with legal action after a historian named her as a descendant of a merchant who enslaved his ancestors. Now, there are several factors here that I want you to take into account before telling me what you think. And crucial, I think, to this is the fact that she was only an MP for 4 years. So she was a public figure, if you like, for 4 years. And not a particularly prominent public figure, and not really a public figure who lined her own pockets or feathered her own nest as a consequence of her political career. Right? I'm not 100% sure what I think about this story yet. I don't want to have any fisticuffs or rows, but we might. But I just want to get these things in front of you before we start talking about it. The research student at St Catherine's College in Oxford, Malik Al-Nasir, discovered when researching his own family tree as part of his PhD studies, discovered that his forebears, his ancestors, had been owned, they had been enslaved on sugar plantations in Demerara, which is in the former colony of British Guyana, now known as Guyana. So his ancestors were enslaved. He looked into the history and discovered that Samuel Sambach, or he claimed that Samuel Sambach was the sort of architect of that enslavement, and he gave a TEDx talk in 2021 in which he pointed out that a descendant of the man that enslaved his ancestors had been in government. At the time of the talk, she was no longer an MP, and I think that is relevant to her grievance here. She feels that to have this stigma, this ancestral stigma attached to her, is unfair for two reasons. Firstly, it has absolutely nothing to do with her. She is under there is no doubt whatsoever that in her mind that slavery is absolutely appalling. There's a sort of guilt by association involved in this. Now, the Gladstone and the Trevelyan examples speak of a recognition and an acceptance of that guilt by association. But I'm not sure it is clear-cut, this. Why should there be guilt by association? I feel no guilt whatsoever for anything that my great-great-great-great-great-granddad or grandma did. If I knew, I can't. Guilt is not the right word. Association is the right word, but what by association? Should she be expected to? I think a state, a government, a company, even perhaps a fortune can be retrospectively held to account. But a descendant on an individual, almost moral level, I genuinely don't know. So during the speech that he gave about the research that he'd done, he talked about influential characters within a family, one of which was a sitting MP in Boris Johnson's government, and therefore, in a contemporary sense, the family still had influence. Now my pendulum swings again, you see, because it speaks of how the descendants of men who made their fortunes enslaving other men and women still perhaps have more access to positions of position and influence in modern Britain than A, other people, and B, people who didn't descend from slavers, didn't descend from slavers. So I just want to know whether you, what's the question? Is it, am I asking whether you feel sorry for her? Do you understand her grievance? Or do you think, and this might also be a reasonable position to adopt, do you think she's being very silly? So a former Tory MP has threatened the University of Cambridge with legal action after a historian named her as a descendant of a merchant who enslaved his ancestors. There's no dispute over the accuracy of the research. She is a descendant of a merchant who enslaved his ancestors, but she doesn't feel it's fair for her name to be included in the research on the grounds, essentially, or the reason why it's included in the research is that her name is known. She could be pointed to as a prominent public figure during that period of her membership of Parliament. If she hadn't become a member of Parliament, she would not have been mentioned in this research. That much is clear. She would be unknown. There wouldn't be a case to be made. Sandbach is not a name like Gladstone that has a historical heft. It's not a name like Harewood. It is her contention that it's unfair to her to essentially impute her integrity by association with a slaver ancestor. And I just don't know whether she's right or not. I think the way into this, and you must come at it from whatever angle you please, there's a touch of the Streisand effect going on as well, as Julie points out. We never would have heard of this if she hadn't actually contacted the university repeatedly to try to get herself removed from the TEDx talk film, from presumably the YouTube and elsewhere. But we'll move beyond the Streisand effect and move towards the principles in play here. The facts are undisputed, as I stress, but the question of fairness is what we're talking about, I think, isn't it? I think we're talking about fairness. Is it unfair to name her 200-300 years later in relation to an ancestor who built a fortune on enslavement? I mean, we can come at it from, again, whatever angle you want, but should the university remove her name from this film? Is it fair that she be associated in this way? We live in a strange period. I think you're right. The word we want is shame. Quite a few of you suggesting it's shame, not guilt, that we should be talking about. But I'm not sure, because I haven't walked in anybody else's shoes. I'm not sure you can I mean, if your dad was a massive wrong-un, you'd feel shame. Your granddad, but your great-great-great-great-granddad? I genuinely don't know. But it is that relationship between public profile and public identification that I think is interesting here. Her argument is, I'm only being named because I was briefly an MP, and that's simply not fair because my attitude to slavery is the same as everybody else's. I think it's absolutely disgusting. So is it fair to name her in this research? And or should the university remove her name from it? 0345 6060 973. And if you've traced your descendancy from slavers or enslaved people, I guess it might be more interesting. I mean, if you found out that your ancestors were enslaved, do you have actual personal feelings towards the descendants of slavers? 0345 6060 973. There's a lot to cover here, and let's keep it friendly. But it is a lot more interesting than some of the other... Well, all these conversations are interesting. It's a lot more nuanced, I think, than some of the other conversations you have about slavery. I mean, most recently about reparations, which I can tell you how the debate about reparations is going to go. People whose ancestors have or were enslaved and exploited, the consequences of which continue to reverberate through society centuries later, will be told by the people who were not affected by slavery to shut up and sit down. That's how that debate is going to go, but it won't go away, and people won't shut up and sit down. But that's what you'll get. You'll get privileged white people turning up on the telly telling the descendants of slaves to just be quiet and get over it now, despite obviously having really no right whatsoever to do that. But this is a different conversation, a lot more nuanced. 0345 6060 973. Is it fair that because she was an MP for 4 years, her name will forevermore be included in this account of one of the most appalling acts that humanity has ever visited upon humanity? 0345 6060 973.
James O'Brien on LBC. James O'Brien on LBC.
20 minutes after 11. I like this take from the No Hostages Twitter account. Take a moment to consider how strange this conversation sounds to someone visiting the UK. It's a monarchy with a leader who rules by virtue of their genealogy. There are legislators who hold their seats because they're descended from aristocrats. And along comes Antoinette Sambach trying to sue someone for outlining her genealogy. It's a strange place. You put it like that, and it certainly is. Tina is in Stoke Newington. Tina, what would you like to say?
I basically want to say what you just said, really. Because I think it's really absurd, the fact that she wants to sue the university for just stating things that happen.
She's threatened them with legal action. The Times understands. That's just me clarifying what I've said, not what you've said. No, you've said nothing wrong. I just to get the details absolutely correct. Why? Because I mean, imagine it was you.
Well, if I had a great grandfather that had done something really terrible, I would accept it. You know, I wouldn't expect people to expect me to do the same thing as that person, but I'm still related to that person. They're still part of my family. It's still true. It still happened.
But it won't happen to you because you haven't been an MP. I mean, I wonder if it's the brevity of the time that she was in the House of Commons that intrigues me in this issue, in that she was barely a public figure and she's only included because of that role, and therefore it's not fair, because if she was a bus driver or a heart surgeon, she wouldn't have been mentioned.
Well, how do we know that she wouldn't have been mentioned?
Because no one was. No one was in the talk. I mean, she's literally cited as an example of how you still have influence. Descendants of the family still have influence, in this case, political influence.
But she did have influence. I mean, she chose to take a role where she would be having influence. And I can't see where she can go from there. I really don't. I mean, she made a concerted effort to be in Parliament, even if it was for a very short period of time. And therefore,
go on.
It just staggers me.
She's not a wrong 'un. She's nice, and she was a good MP, and she got an awful lot of stuff right. Well, it was quite brave to stand up and say so. So I don't want to depict her as being dodgy or anything like that.
But that's the problem with it. The implication is that I would see her as being dodgy, and I don't see her as being dodgy. I just see her as being somebody who's got some really nasty relatives in her family tree, and I feel a bit sorry for her about that.
That's really nicely put. Yes.
Yeah, I don't think it hurts for people to know that as well. That people who are good are related to people who've done bad things.
And almost all of us, if you dig back far enough, would find something on our family tree that would probably rather wasn't there. And what about the idea? Because we live in a weird culture And I appreciate it happens a lot more to people on the left than it does to people on the right. You get followed around by bizarre associations forevermore in the internet age. So, you know, if she was a Labour MP, if she was still in Parliament, then I can think of websites that would constantly describe her as the slaver's great-great-granddaughter. And that may change the complexion slightly.
That's the other reason why I think it's important that it is admitted to. Is that the right wing press would take that kind of try and push it all down and stop people from knowing about it. I think it is right and proper that we have a press that will tell stories about things, whether we like them or not, you know, whether they're comfortable for the subject or not.
I think it's going to be hard to argue with that position, and yet I'm almost tempted. I can't do a phone in on why I feel sorry for her, but I do have a modicum of sympathy for her because her feelings are clearly such that she's undertaken this course of action. So it is obviously hurting her. Oh, thank you, Tina. 03456060973 is the number you need if you want to join in. Io is in Watford. Io, what would you like to say?
Thanks. Thanks for having me on, James.
Very welcome.
I've followed yours for a while, and
it's all right.
Show.
Thank you.
Thank you.
There we go. Clear your throat before making your contribution. It's very wise.
That was good.
The phone lines. Actually, no. The phone line's awful. I don't know whether you've just coughed your phone into.
1 second.
If you've got me on speaker, I'm going to be cross.
Can you hear me now? Is that better? I had my earphones. Can you hear? I had my earphones on.
That's much better, yeah.
Is that better?
That's much
okay.
Better. Yeah.
Thank you very much. Now, what I'd like to say is this. Whilst I fully appreciate her emotions in all of this, and one will not try to remove her emotions and how she feels about being, how she's viewed and perceived and all of that, there is a bigger picture to what has happened here.
Yes,
whether she likes it or not, she is a direct descendant of a slave owner.
Yes.
That is a reality she cannot escape from, whether she be public or private.
Yes.
And what lends more credence to actually being discussed publicly is she has served in a public role. And curiously, the question one would ask is if the descendants had not been involved in, slavery, could that be a natural end result for her?
Yes.
It's debatable to ask. That's something to ask it. But also, you asked a question, you said something about, is it fair? The question I want to ask is it fair on those who were enslaved?
Well, I think that's, that's close to being a silly question. It's so obviously not fair.
Yeah.
But she didn't enslave anybody.
No.
So that's why the question of whether or not it's fair for her to be included in this account, I think, is a more nuanced question than whether or not slavery was fair.
I'm trying to make a point there.
I know you are. But I think it's too clumsy a point for our purposes here.
I'm not so sure, but the thing I only say is that the fact that she is associated with a descendant, she's a descendant of a slave owner, is something that, one, she should not try to run away from. And it sounds like that from what she's trying to say. No, don't associate my name with it. It is a reality that she cannot escape from. I think she has one or two choices. She either says, you know what, yes, I am. And like the lady before said, it's not a reflection of who she is as a person. Nobody's judging that.
So in many ways, she needs a bit of help, a bit of counsel, not in terms of psychological counselling, but in terms of a good chat with somebody about why she shouldn't be so upset about this.
Right. Yeah, it's in some respects. And so I'm not so sure if, looking at making a threat of legal actions, whether it's a right course of action for her. Of course, she's entitled to what she wants to do in that manner. But it brings this issue of slave trade and people trying to separate themselves and all of that. It really brings it to the fore, and it raises a lot more questions about things. Speaking as somebody who is as a black person and knowing the impact of all of that, even as we speak today, it's almost like an entitlement. Someone who is entitled would make this kind of statement. It almost feels like that, So, but I hope she considers it and actually just rather than try to run away from it. Accept that that's what it is. Laura Trevelyan did a brilliant response to this, and the family, they did. It doesn't solve the whole problem, but the acknowledgement of it goes a long way.
I suppose, think of it this way, finally. She's just saying, look, could just leave me out of it, will you? She's not objecting to the history. She's not objecting to the research. She's certainly not defending anything that anybody did. She's certainly not questioning the fairness, the fundamental horror, the Holocaust of slavery. She's not doing any of those things. She's just saying, could please leave me out of it? And that's where my sympathy comes from.
Of course, we can all have sympathy for her position, and that's fine. It's one thing to have sympathy for the position, but to say now that now needs to say, okay, now no, leave her out of it. It's impossible, because the very fact of who she is, whether she likes it or not, has benefited from the profits of slavery.
In some way, I mean, there may not be a financial inheritance, but there's going to be some form of social capital that almost certainly derives from the privilege and wealth enjoyed by her ancestors. Thank you, Ayo. That was very helpful. And of course, in a way, if you're watching this thing and the name Sambach comes up, she wasn't prominent enough for you to go, I wonder if, but it's a rare enough name, I keep thinking there was a bloke in Sambach who rang us. It was one of the most racist calls I've ever taken on the program. I don't know if you remember it. It was surreal. That's another. That must be named after the family, mustn't it? The town, because it's somewhere in Cheshire. It's some service stations there, isn't there? And maybe there's a link. I don't know. But you would think, I wonder if this bloke is related to that politician from a few years ago, and then you'd find out pretty quickly that she was. But in terms of it being contained within the lecture, saying, couldn't you just leave me out of it? I don't think it's an unreasonable request, but it may be, as Ayo suggests very powerfully, unreasonable to agree to it.
James O'Brien on LBC. James O'Brien on LBC.
It is 11:34, and you are listening to James O'Brien on LBC, where I think I've distilled it down quite nicely, although we're close to unanimous on Antoinette Sambach being at the very least ill-advised to threaten the University of Cambridge with legal action after a historian named her as a descendant of a merchant who enslaved his ancestors, the Times understands. I remember when Farage went to Germany to speak to the AfD, and it was pointed out that he was there as a guest of the granddaughter, I think, of a senior Nazi. And that seemed to me to be fair, seemed to me to be reasonable, although on reflection, how, because of the political direction that the AfD was determined upon at the time, but there's nothing in Antoinette Sambach's politics that reflects the slavery undertaken, the enslavement undertaken by her ancestors. But I don't know. I mean, how long do you stay? And she's not accountable for it. But if she says, please, why bring me? Please leave me out of it. I understand why she's done it, but I don't necessarily. And I have sympathy for her doing it, but I don't necessarily. In fact, increasingly talking to you, I increasingly think this was probably an unwise course to take. Olita is in Forest Hill. Olita, what would you like to say?
Hi, James.
Hello.
How are you?
Very well, thanks.
Nice to speak to you.
Likewise.
After listening for so many years. So I just wanted to make the point. I just wanted to agree with the last part of what your previous caller, Ayo, was saying. As a black person, it does feel like a bit of a double whammy, which is that you have had slavery inflicted and all the impact, and then to have the privilege of saying, don't name me in association with this, I think is a bit of a slap in the face, because there aren't that many opportunities to draw the illustration to the modern day of what happened before. And this is one of the few illustrations where the timeline can be illustrated, and then we're being told to be quiet. So I don't agree with that. But no. I would like, if you allow me to just give an illustration. I think I understand why you have the sympathy. I don't agree that she should ask not to be named, but I fully understand why she doesn't feel comfortable.
Yes.
So if you draw a comparison with South Africa and the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, during that process, the whole country together had to go through the process of understanding exactly what had happened in terms of the atrocities,
yes,
even though individuals weren't directly responsible. But collectively, the nation had to say, look what we've done as a nation, look how horrific this was. look how long it took to kind of
truth and
make things
reconciliation.
better. Look at exactly. But in the UK, we've never had that process of it's all been kind of swept under the carpet. No one wants to talk about it. You've got all these historic buildings, and the nation was built on slavery. But collectively, we haven't come to that point where we've said, look, this is us and this is what we've benefited from. So as an individual, when she is named, she feels as though it's why me? Why should it all be pinned on me? Whereas if collectively we'd already had that process where everybody knew it was everybody, and the whole nation was involved. There was, the monarchy was involved. The Bank of England, everything was involved, and that was the pinnacle of how the country was built. Then, if we had that process, then following that process, if individuals were named, because that education has already happened, people won't kind of focus so much on the individual. And so that is the problem. The problem is we need to have that process. We've never had that process. And had we had that, already, then people wouldn't feel like it's personal. And she feels that it's personal to her because not many people are being named individually.
No.
So it's either...
But they should be, clearly.
They should be. And I think everybody should be. So people should understand it's not that individual, even if you are naming individuals. But for us as black people, it's not fair to say this crime was committed, but we're going to protect, the history of all the perpetrators by not talking about it. That's like a double whammy. That's like, blaming the victims who are still being impacted for wanting to explore more.
Yes.
And that's why she feels how she feels. So I understand fully why she feels how she feels. But I think this is the moment where we can start to have a conversation moving forward and say, let's name everybody, and then you're not going to be alone. At the moment, she probably feels alone.
Yes, I that's a really good way and quite a generous, or at least a sympathetic way of looking at it. But she feels her head has been put above a parapet, and your point is that really there should be so many heads above that parapet that you wouldn't be able to single anybody out. It would be almost
not to remove hers,
yes,
but to just make it more kind of. There's no knowledge. If you ask anybody today, what the impact has been. You get people talking about, there's no impact today. Even when you're talking about taking down statues, and people have to walk past that every day and go, oh, this is the impact of what happened. Look at David Harewood, as you mentioned. That's the daily impact for him.
Yes.
So people still think that it's, with the Holocaust, you would say, let's never forget. So even when the last Holocaust survivors pass away, sadly, people are never going to go, oh, there's no one alive anymore. So it doesn't matter. But with slavery, it's like, oh, that happened so long ago. No one's alive anymore, so it doesn't matter. But why should it be different?
Yes, and I mean that nails the nuance quite perfectly, doesn't it? In that there is a sort of intellectual basis to her grievance, but there shouldn't be. Circumstances have.
It.
Yes, I can. That's a real. I mean, crikey, had you heard this story before today?
No. I was just listening to your show, but your show is like one of those eye-opening shows anyway. So it's like one of those shows, every time you listen to it, you go, oh, yeah, that's a different take on it. That's a different take on it.
What a lovely thing to say. Thank you, Alita. Well, that's why I do it, in the hope of getting calls like yours.
You're welcome.
Thank you. 20 to 12 is the time. I should read out what Antoinette Sandbach has said about it herself on Twitter. I don't follow all of it, I have to be honest, and I don't mean that as a criticism. I think it refers to some things that I haven't come across yet or haven't referred to, but she tweeted a quite lengthy little thread last night. Mr. Al Nasir, that's the researcher, the PhD student who has done the talk to which she objects, is aware that I welcomed his research and I am appalled by the actions of my distant ancestors. I have spent my life as a legal aid criminal barrister and MP trying to fight for people's rights and to help people in need. I would never seek to prevent free speech or to suppress academic research. In this case, I objected to ongoing data breaches by Cambridge University and Mr. Al Nasir, which compromised my personal safety. ICO News, which is the Information Commissioner's Office. This is the bit I don't follow. ICO News. Of the cottages Al Nasir refers to, I bought one in 2015, built two in 2020 and inherited one. It is a matter of public record that I was repeatedly threatened and a number of people were cautioned and one convicted. A number were never caught, including one who threatened to. I did a trigger alert here for some of the language that she uses and the threats that she describes. A number were never caught, including one who threatened to rape and behead me in front of my family. I think this would be going back to the Brexit period when MPs telling the truth came in for astonishing amounts of abuse from mainstream media, and then even more outrageous abuse from autonomous individuals. My house has alarms on every window, a letterbox designed to be fire resistant, and a number of other safety features I am not going to publicly reveal because of the threats to me. My post scanned for safety reasons in the last 10, and she reminds us that in the last 10 years, 2 MPs have been murdered. There is, of course, an ongoing discussion about the legacy of slavery and how that should be addressed. I am committed to understanding fully the detailed history of my family, and I am committed to looking into it further. I am at the start of my learning journey. Although I have been repeatedly told to go back to where I come from, i.e. Europe, as I'm half Dutch, I have not been the subject of racism, and the closest prism through which I can relate is that of women's oppression. Many of the racist tropes of the past were also used to suppress women's rights. For example, Alexander Crummell was the first graduate of African descent from Cambridge University in the 1840s. Women were not officially allowed to graduate until 1948. And I note that Cambridge University has refused to publicly list the names of donors with links to slavery in their interim report on slavery and how the university has benefited from it. So I think from that, and I say again, I'm not fully clear on some of the points being made, but I think that her parapet, the point Alita made so brilliantly, she has already been horribly exposed to public condemnation, ironically, for want of a better word, for telling the truth. While in Boris Johnson's Conservative Party, you'll remember the viciousness and the vileness that, encouraged, I think, in many ways by the likes of the Daily Mail, was directed at these MPs. I think it was the Crush the Saboteurs front page, was it, that referred to them directly? I could be wrong. And that, I think, is why she is upset to see herself once again, despite no longer being an MP, once again being put above the parapet. I don't know whether that adds to your understanding of the issue or increases your sympathy. Unfortunately, I don't know how relevant it really is in the great scheme of things. If the argument is, please don't mention me in the context of this because of the unpleasant experiences I've had in the context of something else entirely, I don't know that it addresses the intellectual nucleus of this entire conversation, which Alita just articulated perfectly, i.e., yeah, it is unfortunate for you personally that your head is above the parapet on this issue, but that is actually a consequence of a nationwide denialism surrounding this entire issue. More of your thoughts after this.
James O'Brien on LBC. James O'Brien on LBC.
11:48 is the time, and I told you it was a more nuanced story than perhaps some of the headlines allow, but there has been not a single syllable of support for Antoinette Sambach's attempts to get her name removed from a TEDx talk about slavery in particular that focuses or references one of her forebears, Samuel Sambach, the co-founder of a company that monopolized much of the Demerara sugar trade in the 18th and 19th centuries, involving deriving a substantial amount of wealth generated from slavery, and mentioning in this talk given by a third-year PhD student at St. Catherine's College, Cambridge, the fact that he is a forebear of somebody who had been an MP very recently. And it is evidence of how the families built upon those pasts retain arguably undue and disproportionate influence and access to power today. I really think it does. There's a little bit more as well. I don't know. I don't want it to sound like a pursuit of Antoinette Sambach, but I do think that this is also relevant, that she has been in the public eye for a little longer than the fact that she joined the House of Commons in 2019 allows. I beg your pardon, 2015 until 2019. She ran for the Welsh Assembly in 2007, so a little longer perhaps in the public eye. And the family has farmed in the, and I'll get told off by my Welsh listeners for mispronouncing this, the Elwy Valley, which runs through Conwy County, for 6 generations. And today her home is a slate-fronted house once occupied by the estate's foreman, and which dates back to 1840. So, the whereabouts of the wealth is pertinent, I think. You're having a conversation about the role that slavery played in the creation of modern Britain. I think you have to point at families that remain prominent due to the wealth derived from enslavement. I was almost today years old when I discovered that the compensation paid upon the abolition of slavery went to the owners of human beings, not the human beings who had been traded like animals. 10 minutes to 12 at a time. Ian is in... Yeah, I just gave myself a hard time for mispronouncing a Welsh place. And you've put this on the board without any phonetic help on how to pronounce it at all. I'll have a go, Ian, if you promise not to laugh. Achilbuie.
I'm laughing.
Yeah, what is it?
Achilbuie.
Achilbuie. In Scotland?
Yes, it's in Scotland.
Yeah. What would you like to say, Ian?
I did quite a lot of I did the original research on this story for the Sandbatches and also on the Gladstones.
Gosh.
Did it 7 years ago.
Right.
And the connection is football.
Go on.
People down south don't really know this, but Scotland had the first black international player in 1882, and he was also captain of Scotland. His name was Andrew Watson.
I did not know that.
Andrew Watson's grandmother and Gladstone's mother were cousins. Not direct cousins, but second or third cousins.
Okay.
They were Robertsons.
Good Lord.
So there was a family connection. Peter Miller Watson, Andrew's father, who was white, his mother was a mulatto,
right,
worked for Sandbach Cheney. Sandbach Cheney were an Anglo-Dutch family concern.
Right.
And you're quite right, they were involved in sugar, they were involved in slaves, they had slaves.
Yes.
So the point I was making was that the Sandbach situation is very much like the Gladstone connection.
Gosh,
the Gladstones have been very open in what they've done finally.
Yes.
Because what happened was, as you know, John Gladstone was the largest slave owner of them all.
Mm.
And when the Emancipation of Slavery Act was passed, compensation was paid. Therefore, he got the largest sum, I think, or the second largest sum. And what the families did then was very cleverly converted that money mostly into railway shares and made an absolute fortune on the railways as well.
Right. So
that the wealth continues down. And these families have this wealth in the background all the time. You've just described what Sandbach has. The Gladstones are not exactly poor. So we have a situation where, in my view, what the Gladstones have done has been correct. They've faced up and fessed up. And Sandbach really does need to do the same, just accept that that's the way it is. And if she's quoted, fine, she's quoted. Mm. It's all on record anyway. All you have to do is to go into the files and look at the slave owning records at the time of the emancipations when they decided on the compensations.
And you discovered this because you were researching Andrew Watson?
My interest is football. I'm a member of the Scottish Football Historians Group, and I've been a pioneer in this particular area.
Oh, fantastic. Did you publish your research?
It's up on the net. It's been up on the net for 7 years.
What's your full name? Can you refer people to it if they want to have a look?
The Scots Football...
Because he was born in Demerara. Andrew Watson was born in Demerara, which is where this conversation started.
But he was brought over when he was, I think, 3, 4, 5. He went to school in Halifax. He went to Wimbledon, to school in Wimbledon. Is it Wimbledon College, I think, isn't it?
King's College, Wimbledon, probably.
Yes, exactly. Yes. He went there, and then he went to Glasgow University, came up and went to Glasgow University, and that's how he became involved in football in Glasgow. And because he was resident in Glasgow, he was qualified to play for Scotland.
How remarkable! I mean, that's just fascinating.
I know the chap from Cambridge. I think his name is actually Watson. He's adopted a name. It was a Muslim name, but I think his given name in the beginning was Watson. Oh. And I think he might be related to the Watsons in some sort of way.
He's certainly traced his forebears to the plantations.
Yes, Demerara, and he was involved because we also, as a group, the Scottish Football Historians Group, discovered the grave of Andrew Watson in Richmond Cemetery. It had remained hidden. In fact, it was a guy called Andy Mitchell who did this. And I think this chap from Cambridge was actually at the ceremony when the grave was actually sort of renovated and reopened.
What an incredible story. Did someone alert you to the fact that we were talking about this?
I listen to you most days.
So you know what a Ray Liotta is then?
I know what a Ray Liotta is.
Well,
I really don't need one.
You really got one.
I'm Ray Liotta, and you're listening to James O'Brien on LBC. If you build it, they will come.
Thank you.
That's objectively incredible that we were conducting this conversation today that is entirely derived from or descended from, pardon the pun, from research that you undertook because of your fascination.
I suspect it is because I did it quite a long time ago. I mean, 7 years ago, 6 or 7 years ago, and it's been up there a long time.
And it would be a research. It would become a research resource, wouldn't it?
Well, it's there. That's what it's there. The whole Scots football worldwide is a research resource for the involvements in Scots in taking football around the world, because in reality it was Scots who took football around the world, often as railway engineers or labourers rather than English people.
Yeah, but we managed to get to 11:55 with this conversation, which was potentially quite inflammatory, being gloriously uncontroversial, and now you've absolutely blown that up, Ian, by laying claim to the Scottish role in popularising football as opposed to the English role.
Look at the website. You'll see. I think it's 28 countries
where it was delivered to. Look, that's fantastic.
You know, when you have a situation in Argentina where the three main instigators of football were Andrew Watson Hutton, Alex Lamont, and Arnott Leslie, and
there's a bit of a clue.
Six of the first Argentinian football team were either Scots or the sons of Scots. It's kind of pretty obvious. Huh?
Yeah, you're not wrong. And who was the lad at Brighton as well who won the World Cup? Was that a Scottish name, wasn't it?
McAllister.
Yes,
Alex,
of course it was.
McAllister.
Yeah, there you go. There's more proof of it as well. Fantastic stuff. Thank you so much for that. That's absolutely made my day. And one of the most richly deserved Ray Liotas ever, I think. From Ochiltebui, is that it? I got close to Montreux in Switzerland. Sarah, what would you like to say?
Hello. Yeah, I wanted to talk about the fact that this is all about the privilege that Antoinette, what's her surname? Sorry,
Sambach.
Antoinette Sambach wants that we don't have.
Yes.
A tiny bit about me. I'm from a Caribbean family on my mother's side, and we don't get to really hide where we come from. We don't get to hide that we come from enslaved people, and we don't get to hide either that we come from enslavers. I think it's something that's often forgotten in these conversations, is that brown people from the Caribbean are not just black people. They also usually have white bloodlines that come from where you can very well imagine.
Well, I just talked about it a bit with Ian a moment ago.
Yeah, and just the fact that she's asking for a privilege that we don't have is.
I want to opt out of my personal history. Is what she's saying in a way that other people can't.
But you can't. And asking for that privilege when nothing in your everyday life is going to be bringing you back to that is, I mean, very self-centered, if I want to be nice about it, honestly.
Yes.
I go about my life with, whatever happens to me in terms of stereotypes that people have or stigma that people have are gonna put on me for what I look like. And it just seems a little bit indecent, honestly.
It's a strong word, but I understand why you've used it. I also understand to a degree where she's coming from. I thought Alita's argument about parapets was very powerful in that she feels aggrieved because it's just her head above this parapet and there should be millions of heads in the same place. So you can possibly see that, can you, or not?
But there's a big difference between saying that we need to talk about this more so my head is not up alone here and saying, oh, well, I deserve to be behind the wall.
You're right. You're absolutely right. I think Alita would agree with you. We're just trying to understand on a very personal and subjective level where Antoinette Sambach is coming from, because I don't think she's coming from an ugly place. Privilege is almost always unconscious, and I know that's not what you're suggesting.
No, I mean, I'm currently living in a very, very lily white place in Switzerland. I mean, I know that it's true. Most of the people here actually really believe that racism does not exist because Switzerland is lovely and, full of fountains and lakes and mountains. And well, that's not the reality of it. Right. It doesn't express itself in as quite a violent way as other places, but it is there.
Yes.
And it can be quite tiring to hear people bemoan the loss of a privilege that you've never had.
Yeah. That's, I mean, wow, what an hour and what a conclusion. Thank you, Sarah.
Thanks a lot, James. Have a lovely day.
You too. And that is the end of that. for now at least. I can't remember the last time I was just. I feel like a squash ball during the second half of that hour. That every call was just smacking me off in a completely different direction in a most enjoyable way, but I feel completely educated. And I hope if Antoinette Sandbach was listening, or if she listens to this programme on Catch Up, I hope she recognises that almost all, in fact all of that did come from a place of understanding, but of understanding other perspectives as well, intrinsically linked to the slave trade from the other side of the epic historical injustice, and therefore perhaps Sarah's words will resonate longest with the notion of privilege and not even realising that you're exercising it. I'm going to talk about birds next.
James O'Brien on LBC. James O'Brien on LBC.
4 minutes after 12 is the time. You're listening to James O'Brien on LBC, where that conversation in the last hour was absolutely brilliant. There wasn't a book, John, on the Scottish football, but Ian's work, Scottish Football Historians Group online will lead you in the direction in which you need to go. So, a bizarre story unfolded online. I just want to read you something from the Telegraph today that you may have missed, because you possibly think sometimes when I talk about the people who are opposed to the truth that I am exaggerating. So this is a piece inevitably in the comment pages of the Daily Telegraph, which are, I mean, in the realms of fantasy writing. They give Neil Gaiman and Terry Pratchett a run for their money, but unfortunately this is allegedly journalism. So someone called Tim Stanley, writing in the Telegraph today, writes, by focusing on old shibboleths like fact and consistency, his old media critics make themselves sound arcane. I'm not sure I've ever seen such a blatant admission, albeit implicit, from a very right-wing journalist that facts and consistency are out of favour, that facts and consistency are old-fashioned and unnecessary. A shibboleth is a sort of custom or principle that distinguishes a particular group of people. So it's usually regarded as outmoded. Just think about that again. The Daily Telegraph, my late father's newspaper, it always pains me to imagine what he would make of what that newspaper has become. In an article essentially blowing smoke up the backside of the Republican candidate Ramaswamy, a peculiarly unpleasant individual running for the Republican nomination in America at the moment. This fellow Stanley writes, by focusing on old shibboleths like fact and consistency. So he's literally writing in a national British newspaper that facts and consistency, focusing on them, makes you sound arcane, makes you sound well out of touch, really old-fashioned. You're not supposed to say that bit out loud. You're supposed to pretend that the people telling the truth are liars. You know, that's how Antoinette Sandbach ended up being in receipt of death threats that we referred to in the last hour. The politicians who were telling the truth about Brexit when Johnson and Cummings had them in their sights were the liars. They were the ones not telling the truth. You're not supposed to admit that focusing on fact and consistency is the thing that you're waving goodbye to. And it is of a piece with broader movements at the moment. We touched on the National Trust in the last hour, and there are people desperately opposed to telling the truth about the National Trust. Even Farage has stuck his dirty oar into that issue by claiming that they need to have some sense knocked into what's the National Trust doing, revealing the actual history of the houses that they own and operate. I don't want to hear the history of the house that I'm visiting. I just want to have a nice cream tea. Thank you very much. Incredible, really. So you're opposed to the truth. Here's some truth. We don't want that. Thank you very much. And it is very much of a... So, you know, Grant Shapps, Michael Green, Sebastian Faulds, you can become Secretary of State for Defence in this country, having made your fortune selling get-rich-quick schemes on the internet under a variety of false identities. The truth doesn't matter. Facts and consistency. You don't even have to use your real name to make money in Brexit Britain. Or rather, to end up as Defence Secretary, having made your money under false names in Brexit Britain. So you're opposing the truth, the opposition to the truth. An actual active resistance of truth, while claiming that you are somehow defending free speech or that you are somehow on the side of the angels. It's incredible to watch. I don't think it's going to end up where it can end up, but it's a crucial constituent of fascism or fascist takeovers. The truth becomes undesirable. The truth becomes an untruth almost. You have a complete subversion of well, facts and consistency. It's the only way you can get terrible things over the line in supposed democracies. Dawn Butler getting slung out of the House of Commons for calling Boris Johnson a liar because the rules which put her in contempt were not ever designed to accommodate a liar as egregious and as blatant as Boris Johnson. The system is supposed to, the system of good chap politics doesn't have the space for a Trump or a Johnson. It doesn't have the vocabulary, the bandwidth to accommodate people as morally depraved as those two. It just doesn't know how to deal with it. So Dawn stands up and calls him a liar and gets thrown out of the House of Commons. But of course, she knew what she was doing. She felt, if I don't do it, who will? Sometimes you have got to call liars liars. BBC won't ever do it, sadly, although they're getting slowly and belatedly better. And Dawn, of course, is my guest on Full Disclosure. That you can. It's a new one today being released with Mark Gatiss, actually. It's two absolute corkers, but you can still listen to and watch now. They're on YouTube now as well. You can see it in glorious Technicolor and marvel at the epic failures of both my stylist and my posture coach. To two people who, frankly, should never work again in this country or any other. But I mention this because the RSPB, or RSPB England at least, posted a tweet in which they described Rishi Sunak, Michael Gove and Therese Coffey as liars. It was a very impassioned tweet for the RSPB to undertake. It stuck out. I follow RSPB England on Twitter, and I am indeed a member of the RSPB. We have a full family membership of the RSPB. And the tone of it was staggering to me because they don't normally come out this strongly. The National Trust has had to fight a rearguard action against the enemies of truth, the people who don't want the National Trust to be telling the truth. And now the RSPB has had to do so as well. Just on the simple question of accuracy, here's Michael Gove in 2017. He said, "I'm glad that we're now at this stage because actually Britain outside the European Union can have higher standards on the environment and indeed on animal welfare." That's a lie. The European Union only ever put in a baseline on animal welfare and environmental standards. So you were not allowed to go below it. You could go as far above it as you wanted. You could have as much animal welfare and environmental standards as you pleased, but you couldn't go below the collectively agreed standards that membership of the European Union entailed. This week, he has said that scrapping EU-era environmental protections on nutrient neutrality is a Brexit benefit to boost housing. And the moment that this was announced, the shares in housing companies rocketed. You would have done well to stick a few quid into a housing company shortly after this announcement was made because it weakens environmental protections. It takes away the responsibility of house builders to protect water quality and places it instead, if I've understood correctly, with residents. But that's not really the point about this story. The point about this story is that after they told the truth, because Rishi Sunak, Michael Gove and Therese Coffey are liars, and they did promise to protect or even improve environmental protections, and they have instead determined to diminish them, the RSPB tweeted this: "Liars," in capital letters with an exclamation mark. Rishi Sunak, Michael Gove, Therese Coffey. You said you wouldn't weaken environmental protections, and yet that's just what you are doing. You lie and you lie and you lie again, and we've had enough. And then things kicked off a bit. I suspected at the time that whoever was in charge of the social media account probably didn't have a hotline to the chief executive's office. This does happen sometimes. Occasionally, infamously, this happens. And that indeed is what sources have told the Telegraph, that a junior staff member went rogue while bosses were on holiday. The chief executive has subsequently apologised and insisted that she did not approve the post and that it did not go through normal protocols. And she stressed that the charity was not entering politics. However, they have refused to delete the tweets, arguing that removing them would have drawn more attention to it and reignited the story. I don't know whether that's true or not. I think perhaps it isn't. But I was particularly struck by the comments of one trustee of the RSPB, a man called Ben Caldecott, who said, whatever one thinks of the government's policy proposals and record on nature, these tweets are not an appropriate contribution to our public discourse from such an important and highly respected organisation. And we're back in the realms now of people who are telling the truth being told to shut up, because everything in that tweet is true. They did promise that they would not weaken environmental protections, and they are weakening environmental protections. I mean, there are other areas of interest here that are worth drawing attention to, not least the fact that the fellow I've just referred to, Ben Caldecott, is a senior fellow at one of the secretly funded right-wing think tanks, loosely described as Tufton Street, of course, although they're not all located there in the same way that newspapers are no longer located on Fleet Street, but we all know what we mean by Fleet Street. And that think tank was co-founded by Michael Gove. And you think that's amazing. Wait till you read my new book. It's got links like this on almost every page. So there is a secretly funded think tank co-founded by Michael Gove, of which a senior fellow is a trustee also of the RSPB and has come out attacking the RSPB for calling Michael Gove a liar. You can't make that up, right? That's Britain for you. That is the establishment now in this country. That's the ecosystem that we've created. That's the three-pronged assault upon democracy and accountability undertaken by right-wing media, right-wing politicians and secretly funded think tanks. You now have somebody quoted in a right-wing newspaper as a trustee of the RSPB, condemning the RSPB for calling a liar because that liar happens to be the bloke who founded the think tank of which he is a senior fellow. I mean, I told you I was turning into the kid out of The Sixth Sense, but I don't see dead people. I just see the links that you never get told about, and I see them everywhere. The question is this. Well, actually, no, I'll give you a couple more quotes, actually. There's a kind of question surrounding when is an apology not an apology. I get caught up in that very occasionally myself. Last time I think it happened when I posted that picture of Suella Braverman cackling outside the facility where they were claiming refugees were going to be put up in Rwanda, and the original photograph had two people alongside her laughing. And apparently the fact that I put up according to the Daily Mail, the fact that I put up the one where she was just on her own, it was the only one I'd seen at the time, was evidence of some terrible, dark, left-wing conspiracy. But the Daily Mail at least had the grace to admit that later that day, when people were accusing me of all, I put up the other one as well. It was just as damaging and just as horrific. There was no dilution of how unpleasant she looked by the fact that two other people were with her in the photograph. But you see that kind of pretending that there are conspiracies afoot when there aren't is usually undertaken by the people who are part of the ecosystem, in which a bloke who is a senior fellow of a think tank founded by Michael Gove can be quoted in a right-wing newspaper attacking the organisation that called Michael Gove a liar because he lied. Should the RSPB be doing stuff like this? I categorically and passionately believe that they should, but I suffer occasionally from undergraduate-itis. I get a touch of the Wolfie Smiths. So I don't honestly know. If you're a fellow member of the RSPB, I think you can go to the front of the queue. 0345 6060 973 is the number that you need. Because the way they get away with it, right? The way they get away with it is by riding roughshod over decency and standards while pretending that they uphold them. Look at Boris Johnson, or Michael Gove, of course. Peas in a pod in many ways. You have... I think it's absolutely ridiculous that they've apologised because they did absolutely nothing wrong. If you cannot call a liar in the public space, then lies will go unchallenged. We should have been calling people liars during the Brexit debates. We certainly should have been calling more people liars after the Brexit debates. Look at the promises that were made to you about everything from the cost of living to the cost of food to frictionless trade to the German car company. Liars. They're liars. They're all liars. But the BBC and other members of the media and institutions, we're all too decent. Oh, I can't call you I couldn't possibly call him a racist. Even in my own home, I wouldn't call him a racist, BBC journalist said to me once about a massive racist. You've got to call it for what it is. And then, of course, they all clutch their pearls and pretend to be outraged and go, I can't believe the RSPB is getting involved in things like... They're telling the truth. It's not the RSPB getting involved in politics that upsets people like Ben Caldecott, Senior Fellow of Policy Exchange. It's the fact that they're telling the truth that they're cross about. Here's a liar. I'm calling you a liar. Oh, that's how James O'Brien is a disgrace to his profession. How dare he go around bandying... Is he or is he not a liar? Did he or did he not promise that environmental standards would never be reduced? Yes, he did promise that. And have they been reduced? Yes, they have been reduced. Therefore, he is a liar. So why on earth are you picking holes in the reputation of the RSPB instead of going after Michael Gove, Therese Coffey and Rishi Sunak like a rat up a proverbial drainpipe? You are a liar. If you're not, sue me. So is this what you want the RSPB to be doing? Because it seems to me sometimes nobody else is. The Labour Party isn't. Dawn Butler accepted. The media isn't. Daily Mirror, Guardian possibly accepted. I think it was brilliant what the RSPB did. Whether it was a junior member of staff going rogue or whether it was actually sanctioned at a higher level. They are, and also, that someone really cares passionately about... How can you live in a country where they're pumping shocking amounts of sewage into our waterways and into our watercourses and think that the problem here is the RSPB calling out lies from politicians who promise to protect environment? I mean, that line from Gove in 2017 saying we can go even higher, that's a lie. That is a demonstrable, palpable lie. But this Caldecott character, and then I don't even know who, but I can tell you without checking that they will have phoned up some desperate for publicity Conservative MPs to get them to criticise it as well. Probably that Clark Smith character. Oh no, I tell a lie. Mark Jenkinson has called for the Charity Commission to strip the RSPB of its status. The RSPB should be stripped of its charitable status for accurately describing Michael Gove, Therese Coffey and Rishi Sunak as liars. Talk me through that, will you, for a minute? 0345 6060 973. And because these newspapers create the discourse, same newspapers that went after the National Trust for telling the truth, now going after the RSPB for telling the truth, because it's not the behaviour of the organisations that they object to, not ultimately, it's not the National Trust's policy that they object to, or the RSPB's tweet that they object to, it's the factual basis of both that they object to. These are projects designed to keep the truth away from the people. Don't tell them the truth about National Trust houses. Don't tell them the truth about Sunak, Gove and Coffey's pledges on environmental concerns. Keep lying to them. Keep misleading them. Keep them in the dark. I think the RSPB, frankly, deserves an award for this tweet. But I could be wrong because, as I say, I occasionally suffer from a touch of the Wolfie Smiths, a touch of the undergraduate outrage. You tell me whether or not what the RSPB did in this case was good or bad. We'll have a good old-fashioned Friday binary ding-dong. 0345 6060 973. Liars. Rishi Sunak, Michael Gove, Therese Coffey, you said you wouldn't weaken environmental protections, and yet that's just what you are doing. You lie and you lie and you lie again, and we have had enough. And if the RSPB can't say that in public, then who the hell can?
James O'Brien on LBC. James O'Brien on LBC.
It's 24 minutes after 12. You're listening to James O'Brien on LBC. I mean, what? I can't keep doing topics based upon the question of what the hell is going on. But if the RSPB can't call liars liars, then what is actually going on? And if some fellow from a secretly funded hard right think tank can pop up attacking the RSPB despite being a trustee of the charity for describing the bloke that founded the hard right secretly funded think tank where he works as a liar, then what does that say about our democracy? Carol's in Romford. Carol, what's going on?
Well, I don't think they should have apologised. I think that is wrong. I didn't ever think I'd hear the RSPB come out and say it like it is, but
it's not what you expect from them, is it? You expect corn crakes and tea towels, perhaps.
That's right,
yes.
And I feel that the RSPB are doing their best to sort of, now the weather's changed and everything like, to help fight floodplains, help do their sort of bit. And it just feels like the government just saying, don't bother, don't do anything. And there's lots of people been volunteering and fighting this for years, and it's just a slap in the face. And I think they were right to call it. They really were.
Yes, and they didn't apologise, but they didn't delete it either. So I suppose in a way it's only half an apology.
Yeah, it is. But I'm hoping that will stick. People, now you've made it more public, because I'd read it a few days ago and thinking, not heard anything about this.
No, well, it's
and when I saw they'd apologised, I was horrified.
Horrified's a strong word, but you know, if you can't call liars liars, what can you do?
It's a bit like living in America under Trump, isn't it?
Well, it's got elements of that. It is, yeah. It's an attempt to sort of redraw or recalibrate reality. Thank you, Carol. Are you a member of the RSPB?
Yes, I'm a member for about 30 years now.
Yeah, well, really, I've only been a member for 2 years, but it's extremely good value. I recommend it heartily. I really do. But, I mean, crikey. Some of these think tanks are charities. They have charitable status. Neil's in South Hams. Neil, what do you reckon?
Well, there's lots to start with on this.
Take your time, mate. There's no rush.
For a month, so I'm kind of getting catch up. Okay. This morning you had LBC had a guy on Nick Ferrari who from Falkland Comms, I think it was,
right,
who's an ex-Sun journalist. Now I'm a Liverpool supporter, so I don't hold much weight to what these people say anyway. But
fair enough.
He said they had basically one of two options, and that is not true, because what they've done, as you rightly pointed out, they haven't really apologised, they haven't taken it down, and the media have been talking about it for 2 days, and he would pay his right arm for that, and so they've got this exactly right. They've called people liars, who've done this. They've called it out for what it is. But they also, I think you've kind of already said it, it's from an organisation where you'd expect shortbread and tea towels.
Yes.
It's like the National Trust saying it. You just wouldn't expect it.
No, well, the National Trust has had to get involved in similar agitations as well because of people who are opposed to the truth. It's quite incredible to see the links in a way. Is it true or not? That's not the point. They shouldn't be doing. No, is it true or not? Is it true or not? Yes, it is true. This house was built on the funds of slavery. Or, yes, this politician did promise that they wouldn't reduce environmental protections, and now they have. It's bizarre, isn't it?
I mean, I read something, I think it was in The Guardian yesterday. It may or may not have been The Guardian, but I read it somewhere yesterday, that something to do with the charitable status and them getting involved in political discussion, that they're not allowed to do it. Now, personally, I don't really have an issue with this because Michael Gove said we've had enough of experts, but these people are experts in bird habitat and the consequence of actions of this government that's going to affect. So, I don't know, maybe we should be paying attention to experts who actually know what they're talking about.
That's a really good point. You're knitting,
secretly funded. It's
another theme, isn't it? It's who should we be taking our information from? The people who've dedicated their lives to studying and disseminating, or the people who, I don't know, just turned up at the job interview last week and got a job as a fellow.
Yeah.
Nicely put, mate. You're catching up fast. It's coming up to 12:30. Couple of phone lines free on this. 0345 6060973 is the number you need. Listen, I know I went a bit high level. I went a bit passionate on this, but I could be wrong. So if you want to say that why, like sensibly why, not like a human pudding like Mark Jenkinson, a kind of sensible explanation as to why the RSPB shouldn't be doing this. It's suboptimal. It's not actually helpful. It might be accurate, but it's not their role. Then I do have plenty of room for that position to be further explored on the programme. The number you need, as ever, is 0345 6060973. 12:30. And Simon Conway is here now with your headlines.
James O'Brien on LBC. James O'Brien on LBC.
33 minutes after 12 is the time. If my inbox is anything to go by, and if everybody is telling the truth, then the RSPB has picked up at least 6 new members this morning or this afternoon. And, of course, the fuss manufactured perhaps around their tweet, quite accurately calling Rishi Sunak, Michael Gove and Therese Coffey liars with regards to environmental protections, is arguably drawing rather more attention than the original tweet did, which I guess is part of the Streisand effect. But I want to know what you think about it. Is this the sort of thing the RSP... I don't know that there's any room to dispute the accuracy of what they've said, which as far as I can tell would be crucial to the Charity Commission's role, if there is any in this process, particularly when you find quotes from Michael Gove lying as long ago as 2017 about somehow being able to enhance environmental standards and protections as a consequence of leaving the European Union, something that is categorically and demonstrably untrue. And yet you could still make a case for saying the RSPB shouldn't be getting involved in stuff like this. 12:34 is the time. Aidan's in Camden. Aidan, what would you like to say?
Hi, James. Yeah, I have a lot of sympathy with what you've been saying today and with the RSPB's position, but I'm afraid I think it does demean such an important institution with so much reputation and expertise to be expressing itself in this way. I think calling someone a liar is quite a serious accusation, and it's an accusation that someone is not only wrong or...
No, they said they wouldn't weaken environmental protections, and they have.
Okay, but what I was going to go on to say is that it's further than that. It's an accusation that the person is actually acting in bad faith. And look, the RSPB has a huge amount of knowledge. Can you just let me finish?
No, I won't let you finish, because I won't be able to concentrate on what you say next if we don't clarify what you said before first.
Okay, fair enough.
So they said they wouldn't weaken environmental protections, and they have. So where's the confusion for you there?
So I think if you were to accuse someone of being a liar and acting in bad faith, what you would be saying is that back in 2017, when Michael Gove said that...
That's a different lie. Sorry, this is why it's important that I do interrupt sometimes, so that I can clarify for you what I've said. So that was a different lie. That's just proof that Michael Gove has a history of lying on this particular subject. But on the promise not to weaken environmental protections, that's this year. I mean, that's the last manifesto. That's constant.
Okay, no, I understand, but I think
now they have weakened environmental protections. So they said they weren't going to do something, and then they did it. What word would you prefer we used to describe the thing they said that wasn't true?
I think the important part of what I was going to say was that if the RSPB is going to make that criticism, and by the way, with their expertise and with their reputation, I don't think it's wrong for them to do that.
Yes.
I think they should make that in a measured, evidence-based way, not on Twitter using this kind of sort of mudslinging language.
Okay, no, I understand that. I mean, I understand that perfectly. That's your, what's the word? Well, that's your sensibilities, though, isn't it?
Yeah, but I think that's incredibly important.
I think everybody's sensibilities are important, but it's not based on anything other than your claim today that you don't like that sort of behaviour on social media.
It's not just that. I mean, I think you talk a lot about Boris Johnson and the degradation of standards in public life.
Yes.
It's undoubtedly broad. I'm afraid I think if we hold ourselves to those new standards rather than the standards that we should be holding ourselves to, then we've really, really lost an awful lot in public life. And I think, fair enough, all of the things that you've mentioned...
No, you can't conflate lying with calling someone a liar.
Lying is much worse, but I still think calling...
So what would you call it? Well, under your reading of more suitable or appropriate behaviour, what would you like to see liars called instead of liars?
I would suggest that the way this should be framed is a forensic examination of what the government has said and what they have done and how inconsistent it is. I think that should come
and if the conclusion as a consequence of that forensic examination is that they have lied, what word would you prefer?
I still don't think in that circumstance...
No, I know, that's what I'm acknowledging. I'm asking what word you would prefer. So here is a liar, and you don't like the word liar, and you don't think the RSPB should be using the word liar. What word would you prefer them to use to describe that liar over there?
Could you give me an example of the kind of finding that you would want them to have found? So, for example,
here is a politician who said we definitely won't reduce environmental protections, and then they did. There's an example.
Okay, fair enough.
So here's that liar right in front of you, the one who lied about not reducing environmental protections. And we're not going to call him a liar because something, RSPB something. What are we going to call him instead?
Fine. So the way that I would frame that is that what the government has done is not consistent with what they said they would do, and we believe they're actually...
there's a character limit on Twitter.
Well, you'd have to be creative and use it.
Go on then. So what single word would you use to replace the word liar?
It doesn't have to be a single word. I think.
All right, you can have 5.
We don't refer to single words.
You can have 5.
No, I think it needs to be a sentence or a set of sentences that simply explain why they believe that they were acting in bad faith and their reasons for doing so. I think that's actually so important that we don't.
That's not really making sense. That's not. It's not mudslinging and name calling. It's an accurate description, and that's why I'm pushing you on what word you would use. What word would you? It's not a pejorative. It's an accurate description. It would be a pejorative if it wasn't true, but it is. No one's disputing that. So here is the liar. What are we going to call the liar who has lied if we're not going to call them a liar after they lie?
I don't think it's necessary to attach a label to someone. I think the facts
okay then. Themselves. Okay, there we go. But the facts are?
Well, the facts are that the government has quite consistently and persistently said they would not weaken environmental protections after Britain left the European Union. And in this instance, there is a weakening of environmental protections.
So they've lied.
I think that stands for themselves. Well, not necessarily.
Okay.
Because a lie implies acting in bad faith. And you haven't necessarily proved that.
Well, a lie doesn't necessarily imply acting in bad faith. A lie implies lying.
No, a lie is bad faith.
But he's a liar.
No, I mean, a lie is implicitly impugning the motive of a person, not the inconsistency in their statement, James.
No, it's both. And I am imputing the motive of the person. He is a liar. He said he wouldn't do something, and then he did. Give me the positive reading of that, the positive analysis of that, the analysis of that casts Michael Gove in a good light.
Well, I think that's a different question.
I know it is. That's why I asked it.
An example might be if you're not to accuse someone in bad faith is he said something back in 2017. Circumstances had changed. He really reevaluated the subject and came to a different conclusion.
But they've been pledging all along that they weren't going to reduce environmental protections, and they have reduced Just forgive me for asking this question, but what's your what's the word I want? What made you pick up the phone today? What is it you object to here? What?
It's about standards in public life, I think.
Okay, and that's incredible. So people listening to this think that your interest in standards in public life is focusing upon the RSPB using the word liar more than on Michael Gove lying.
Not necessarily.
No, it is. You can't keep saying not necessarily. That's what you've rung in to do. You've rung in to object to the RSPB's behaviour in describing a liar as a liar and claiming that your motivation is a concern for standards in public life. You're defending a liar. How about a person who lies? A person who lies. Is that better?
You're not letting me speak, James.
Well, you've spoken quite a lot.
But not in the last few minutes. You've asked people to phone in to say, what do you think of the RSPB's behaviour, not what do you think of Michael Gove's behaviour.
Well, what do you think of Michael Gove's behaviour?
What do I think of Michael Gove's behaviour on this? I think it's clearly inconsistent. I think they've not honoured their promises. Whether or not they've been acting in bad faith in respect of this, I'm going to reserve judgment. Because this ultimately is
Can you think of a word to describe someone who's broken a promise?
Someone who's... Again, it would depend on whether I thought they'd done bad faith or not.
Rhymes with fire.
Sorry?
It rhymes with fire.
I mean, you're just determined to try to lead the witness to the point at which they say someone is a liar.
I'm not, mate. This isn't about the witness. This is about the jury. And they will have arrived at their own conclusions by now, Aidan. Thank you. Anthony's in Bletchley Park. Anthony, what would you like to say?
Hi, James. Good morning. I'm afraid I don't go down the rules of semanticism. They're right to call it out. A lie's a lie. And frankly, I can't see any point in taking the moral high ground when you're actually dealing with the low lights.
But why the apology? Though, have they compromised themselves by apologising and leaving it up, or have they ended up somehow enjoying their cake and eating it?
I think probably the latter, and I hope they thoroughly enjoyed it. They deserve to. But as I was saying to your producer, one of the things that I'm more intrigued about is that why the panic about this? And you remember they had Project Fear a few years ago. I reckon they got Project Lie now. What they're terrified about is if you pull the finger out of the dike from Project Lie, the flood's going to follow.
Yeah, I think you're onto something there.
They can be called out for lying on Brexit, climate, environment, the economy, hospital building, banning lying animal exports, police recruitment numbers, nurse recruitment numbers, safe routes for asylum seekers, and your list goes on as my list goes on. And if you call them out for Michael Gove and Coffey about lying about environmental protection, then everybody else could turn around and say, well, hang about. Isn't Mick Lynch right when he says? Isn't Fergal Sharkey right about what he says? Aren't all these pressure groups right what they're saying? Yeah, and the answer is they are right, because guess what? The government is lying. There's no two ways about it. They are not telling the truth. And it's completely irrelevant to have a semantic argument saying, I don't really want to call them a liar. Well, they're not telling the truth. They've lied. They've lied to all of us. They've seriously lied to all of us.
It's like a Rubicon, isn't it? It's because we don't. This is what I mean by the standards of public life. If we don't do this sort of thing, and I think that may be where the last chat was coming from. We don't really do this sort of thing because it's unseemly. But that leads to Dawn Butler having to stand up in the House of Commons, knowing that she'd be thrown out, calling a liar, because Boris Johnson was lying, and she knew that he was lying, and he knew that she was lying, and the Deputy Speaker knew that he was lying, and everybody who booed her knew that he was lying, but they just desperately didn't want the person calling him a liar to be able to call him a liar.
And so what sort of democracy do we have when somebody who tells the truth gets thrown out of the Houses of Parliament when all those who lie are allowed to vote inside it? It's insane.
The apology even acknowledges the lie while apologising for using the word liar. The RSPB is deeply frustrated by the government's reneging on its environmental promises. There you go. Maybe that would have been a word that was helpful to the last caller. Reneging on its environmental promises. But that frustration led us to attack the people, not the policy. I'm not so sure that I would have endorsed that were I on the RSPB's Board of Trustees. I've got the relevant paragraph as well from the rules and regulations that the Charity Commission imposes, and I can tell you that I know they're kosher because Fergal Sharkey just sent them to me, and he is, as Anthony mentions him in that call, Fergal is listening, as indeed it sometimes feels is everybody else.
James O'Brien on LBC. James O'Brien on LBC.
12:49 is the time, and you're listening to James O'Brien on LBC, where the role of the RSPB in calling some liars liars has caused controversy. I don't know, I haven't got the bit. Has anyone got... Oh, actually, I said I'd read you the relevant bit from the Charity Commission's guidelines, which I think... I mean, it doesn't render it an open and shut case because we could be talking about sensibilities or, this idea. Here's a great line from another trustee, Lord Randall of Uxbridge. Oh, we like him. Lord Randall of Uxbridge has said there's a legitimate question. NGOs are obviously very concerned about this policy, but that has to be explained. This was put out, and he said, I don't think it's representative of the way that the RSPB would normally conduct themselves. Now, and he was critical of the tweet itself, but in much more measured terms than either Ben Caldecott or Mark Jenkinson. And that's the point, I think, that perhaps Lord Randall of Uxbridge has missed, is that this is not the way that the RSPB would normally conduct themselves, in much the same way that Dawn Butler would not normally call a politician a liar in the House of Commons, knowing that it's against the rules and would get her expelled from the House of Commons. But if you do not change your tactics when you are dealing with the abnormal from how you deal with the normal, then the abnormal will triumph and prevail. And what we are seeing now in government and beyond is profoundly abnormal. Therefore, you change your tactics to accommodate the new reality. And the new reality is that we have politicians now who would pick your pocket, who would look you in the eye and tell you it was raining, even as you collapsed with a case of sunstroke. You know that that's true. You saw it with, I suppose, Dominic Cummings, albeit that he's not a politician. Michael Gove was on the radio the next day trying to defend him. So that I don't know what else they are supposed to do. And here's the Charity Commission's guidance on political activity. A charity can campaign using emotive or controversial material where this is lawful and justifiable in the context of the campaign. Such material must be factually accurate and have a legitimate evidence base. I think they're all right. I think they're golden. Martin's in Staplehurst. Martin, what do you make of all this?
I think you just nailed it on the head there, James. The government have kind of been pulling their pants down and saying they're going to do one thing and then doing something completely different.
Yes.
And my point I initially called up to say was that the RSPB is a Royal Society to...
Oh,
Now, with all the environment...
I know what you said, oddly, because you got cut out after you got to the end of the word society. So I'm 99% confident you added for the protection of birds. But your line did cut out, Martin, so I'm just clarifying that for other people.
Okay, cool, thank you. I just think that they're doing their job.
Yes, that's a really good point. A simple point as well. That is, what is your job? To protect birds. What are you doing?
Yeah.
We're attacking people who are harming birds.
Well, like I said, with all the things with the environment that the government are doing, including chucking effluent into the rivers and seas and allowing that to pass with the water companies, and then letting the water companies get away with it, they just pay fees because it's cheaper for them to clean the whole system up.
Yeah.
It makes me absolutely enraged, and it goes with this whole climate change thing as well. They're just not paying attention. They're not paying attention. Exactly.
Driving out. I mean, the people that brought you Brexit are now bringing you attacks on net zero, and of course, oddly, you can even trace the attacks on the National Trust back to Tufton Street or the Institute of Economic Affairs, because some of the characters are involved in both. And lo and behold, there's an RSPB trustee who's also a fellow at the Policy Exchange. I know it sounds like a mad conspiracy theory, but it's not, because it's all there. All the evidence and the receipts are in front of us. But Martin reminding us of the simple truth at the heart of this entire manufactured scandal, which is their job is to protect birds. And at the moment, the best way to protect birds in the context of this story is to call out the people who are harming birds as a consequence of their lies. And therefore, we will call them liars. Martin is in St Asaph. Martin, what would you like to say?
Hi, James.
Hello,
I wanted to make the point that political messaging and advertising is held to a lower standard than product advertising. Yeah. So the Advertising Standards Agency will hold someone advertising a packet of crisps to a higher standard than the electoral guys will hold politicians when they're putting out election leaflets and things like that. So that I think is one big problem we've got. The regulation's not there to over what politicians can say, but then there doesn't seem to be any way for politicians to correct themselves when they are found to be wrong. And I think one of the things you talked about with the previous caller, who was struggling to find another word for lying. I felt that it comes down to what exactly is a lie. If I say I believe the moon is made of cheese,
yes,
I'm not lying if I believe the moon is made of cheese.
No.
But if I know the moon isn't made of cheese, and I say I believe the moon is made of cheese, then it is a lie. But
even then, Martin, this is the Boris Johnson, Donald Trump defence. Even then, I can't prove that you know. I mean, I can put a piece of moon in your hand, and you can say, I still think the moon is made of cheese. I can't prove that you're lying.
Yes, and this is the difficult thing, isn't it? But if politicians, if you can then show that they were wrong,
yes,
right, rather than having to call them a liar, if you can say, look, you were wrong when you said you weren't going to change environmental protections. When you said that, you were wrong. So now you need the opportunity. You need to be able to correct yourself in public. Whereas at the moment, I don't think that happens. Politicians can say they believe anything.
Yes.
And it's not a lie because they're claiming that's what they believe. I believe we won't change environmental protections. Oh dear, we have.
Ups a daisy.
We've done it, but there's no forum for me, or we can't hold that politician to account and say, hang on, you said you wouldn't do it, you have done it, so now stand up and say...
I get it. I see exactly where you're coming from. I think if I were batting for the RSPB, which in a sense I am, they'd probably argue that those old traditional avenues of accountability have closed and failed, and you know, expecting them to correct the record or to account for the fact that they've done the opposite of what they said they would do. That ship has now sailed, therefore they reach for the blunter instruments of calling them liars. But you make a very important point. It's 12:56 already, so I'm a bit late. We're going to play a clip, are we, from this week's Full Disclosure with the wonderful star of Sherlock and the League of Gentlemen and Stage and Screen and now the West End director. Well, look, it's Mark Gatiss. When I interview people, I don't know why, it's just a very personal fascination with how close to the surface the child is. With some people, it's hard to conceive of them ever being children, and then with some people, it's very much clear that the child is not very far from the surface, and your child is quite near the surface.
Oh God, yes,
isn't it?
Breaking out constantly. Well, it's partly because, thank God, and incredibly I'm incredibly blessed that I'm doing almost exactly what I dreamed of doing when I was 8.
Yes.
I mean, with such specificity.
I mean, it's quite incredible, actually, including some of the titles and even programmes that you would have been absolutely...
Doctor Who and Sherlock Holmes, two of the twin pillars of my childhood. So
would it be the Jeremy Brett one, or am I aging you there?
No, Basil Rathbone.
Basil Rathbone,
and the books, really,
yes, of course, and then there you are. Was there so at 8 or at 12? You thought it was feasible, did you? You genuinely thought it was plausible.
Well, this is an interesting thing about the class question, because it certainly seemed distant, but it didn't seem impossible. And I think a lot of that is down to what you were exposed to. You know, I think it's about representation.
Yes.
You have to believe that could be you. I think people often sort of slightly shake their heads about that idea, but it's absolutely true.
Yes.
That if you're a working class black girl, if you don't see yourself on the TV, you don't think these things are possible.
Yes.
And to me, as a working class white boy all those years ago, seeing, as I used to, studying the credits for Doctor Who and wanting to know what a producer did, what a director did, what a script editor did, all these things, by unpicking my favourite show. Weirdly, two of the most influential books of my childhood were technical books, The Making of Doctor Who and The Making of Star Trek.
Wow.
Both excellent books, and I pored over them, not just for the history of the programmes, both of which I love, but how they were done, and everything from the pitch to you know, how they came up with the TARDIS, etc. And they were really useful to me, because you think, well, that's possible. I tell this story a lot, but my friend Arwell Wynne-Jones, who's the designer of Sherlock, he's a very proud Welshman, and he goes around schools to talk to kids about working in television and film. And you know, when he goes in, he says to the class, who's ever thought of working in television? And like one person puts their hand up, and then he talks to them about carpentry, about electricians, about hair and makeup, and by the end of his seminar, they could all work in television.
They've all got their hand
but they wouldn't think, you know, they might not think that unless someone pointed out to you. And I think that's absolutely crucial.
That's
so
lovely.
I didn't think it was definitely going to happen, but I saw a way through, I suppose.
Well, I don't quite follow the because you thought that the people in the credits would be more like you, or I mean, it didn't seem like some sort of strange dream. People were doing those jobs. I knew full well that they lived in the southeast. Yes.
and there were certain things which I used to find as sort of exotic and alien as the planet Skaro. It was the idea of having a lunch in a bistro in Shepherd's Bush. And I do remember, I genuinely thought that Surbiton in The Good Life was made up because it sounded like suburbia.
Right, yes.
I mean, the southeast was like Mars, really.
Mark Gatiss, absolute legend. And I'll tell you what, in the run-up to Christmas, he's going to be in, I think, the unique position of having a play that he has directed in a theatre next door to a play where he's starring. The Unfriend is the one that he's directed, in the National Theatre's production of The Motive in the Queue, in which he plays John Gielgud. I think it's at the Noel Coward. So literally, the Wyndhams and the Noel Coward Theatre are all, I think they're next door to each other. So he's going to be rehearsing one of them, or directing one of them, while starring in... That's just mad, right? Thespy Friends and The Way Old Friends Do, which is an utterly delightful ABBA sort of dark comedy, is at the Criterion until the 9th of September. He directed that, and it was written by and stars his husband Ian Hallam as well. So if you missed any of today's show, you know what to do. You can rewind live radio on Global Player, download it for free from your app store, or go to globalplayer.com. Tom Swarbrick with you at 4. Sangeeta Maiska with you now.
James O'Brien on LBC.